There is a place in America that most people have never heard of, not because it is obscure or unimportant, but because what it suggests about this continent's past makes a great many powerful institutions very uncomfortable. It sits quietly in the landscape, half-buried, wind-worn, older than anything the history books say should be here. And the people who have spent their lives studying it, the ones who have crawled through its passages and measured its alignments and tested its stones with every instrument modern science possesses, many of them will tell you, quietly, carefully, with the practiced restraint of people who know what happens when you say the wrong thing in the wrong room, that nothing about what they found makes sense under the current model of American prehistory. Tonight we are going to follow that thread, slowly, carefully, through the dark. We are going to walk through what the stones actually say, what the science actually shows, and what the silence around it all might mean. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Before we get into the stones themselves, we need to talk about the ground they sit on, because the story of American prehistory, the official story, the one printed in textbooks and repeated in documentaries and taught in lecture halls across the country, begins with a very specific moment. Somewhere between 15,000 and 12,000 years ago, the story goes, small bands of nomadic hunters crossed a land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska. This bridge, called Beringia, was exposed because the Ice Age had locked up so much of the world's water in glaciers that sea levels had dropped enough to reveal a wide corridor of land between two continents. These hunters, following the megafauna they depended on, mammoths and giant bison and horses and camels, walked east and then south. They spread across a pristine, untouched continent. They were the first. Everything before them is silence. Everything after them is the foundation of what we now call Native American civilization. This model has a name. It is called the Clovis First Theory, named after a town in New Mexico where, in the 1930s, archaeologists found distinctive stone spear points buried alongside the bones of extinct Pleistocene megafauna. Those points, later found at dozens of sites across North America, became the founding artifact of American prehistory. They were our Adam and Eve, our moment of creation, our year one. The people who made them were our first Americans. For decades, this model held. It held with the particular stubbornness of a theory that has become not just an academic position but an institutional identity. Generations of archaeologists built their careers on it. Museums organized their collections around it. The story of who was first, and when, and from where, became something close to sacred. And then the cracks started to appear. They started appearing, honestly, decades before most people noticed. Researchers kept finding things in places where nothing was supposed to be, at depths that implied ages that the model said were impossible. They found stone tools in Texas under layers of sediment that could not have been deposited in 12,000 years. They found butchered animal bones in Florida and Virginia and Pennsylvania, with dates that pushed uncomfortably close to 30,000 years and beyond. They found what appeared to be hearths, fire use, in rock shelters in Brazil, so deep in the sediment column that the only honest date you could attach to them was somewhere north of 40,000 years ago. Each time, the response from the establishment was the same. The dating was wrong, the association was contaminated, the researchers had made an error. The model could not be wrong because the model was the model, and there was no room for anything older. But the stones kept talking. And in a particular stretch of New England, in the rolling hills and dense forests of a part of the country most people associate with colonial history and fall foliage and nothing older than a Puritan, the stones were saying something that nobody in any official capacity was prepared to hear. There is a site in Vermont. It has been known to local people for a very long time. European settlers encountered it when they arrived in the 1600s and found it already there, already ancient, already structured in ways that did not look like anything nature alone produces. There were chambers. Stone chambers, built into hillsides, roofed with massive flat slabs weighing several tons each, their interiors carefully shaped, their entrances oriented in directions that seemed deliberate, that seemed calculated, that seemed to know something about the sun. The settlers called them root cellars. They called them colonial storage structures. They filed them away in the comfortable category of the familiar and went on with their lives. But the people who actually studied root cellars pointed out, over and over, that root cellars do not look like this. Root cellars are rectangular. They are dug with the technology and habits of European farming traditions. They have wooden doors and ventilation systems appropriate to the storage of vegetables. They do not have astronomically aligned entryways. They do not have corbelled ceilings made from stones that had to be moved without machinery. They do not have interior niches at heights and positions that suggest something other than the storage of turnips. And yet the root cellar explanation persisted, because the alternative, the thing the structures actually seemed to suggest, was too destabilizing to accept. Let us talk about what these structures actually are. Scattered across New England, primarily in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, there are approximately 105 identified stone chamber sites. Some estimates put the number higher, somewhere around several hundred if you include smaller structures and collapsed examples. They are built from local stone, primarily granite and gneiss, heavy metamorphic and igneous rocks that do not move easily. They are not mortared. They are fitted, stone against stone, in a technique called dry stone construction that requires both significant skill and significant time. The chambers range in size from small alcoves barely large enough for a person to crawl into, to full interior spaces where you can stand upright, where the ceiling arches above you in a corbelled vault that distributes the weight of the earth above across the stones in a way that has kept them standing for an indeterminate but very long time. The most famous of these is the site in Salem, New Hampshire, that has been called America's Stonehenge, though that name, with its tourist brochure implications, perhaps undersells what the place actually is. The Salem site covers approximately 30 acres. It has a central court surrounded by a series of chambers and walls. It has a stone platform that some researchers have identified as a sacrificial table, a large flat stone with grooves cut into it that could have channeled liquid. It has standing stones arranged around the perimeter of the site at positions that align with significant solar and lunar events: the summer solstice sunrise, the winter solstice sunset, the equinox positions, the southernmost and northernmost moonrises. The alignments are not approximate. They are precise to within a fraction of a degree, which means they were either the most extraordinary series of coincidences in American archaeological history, or they were deliberate. Carbon dating at the site has returned dates that range from the early centuries of the Common Era back to several thousand years before the present. Some of the dates are genuinely extraordinary, pushing back to 4,000 years before the present, which places the construction of these structures in the same general period as the Bronze Age in Europe and the Old Kingdom in Egypt. There is no civilization in the accepted record of North American prehistory that could have built this at that time, and that is where the story gets interesting. Let me take you back to Europe for a moment, because you cannot understand what might be happening in New England without understanding what was happening across the Atlantic. Between roughly 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, the people of Atlantic Europe were doing something remarkable. They were building with stone on a massive scale. They were erecting standing stones and stone circles and passage tombs and dolmens across a huge sweep of territory from Portugal in the south to Scotland in the north, from Ireland in the west to Denmark in the east. Thousands of these structures survive. Tens of thousands probably existed before time and agriculture and development removed them. These monuments share certain characteristics. They are oriented to astronomical events. They use large, carefully selected stones. They are built without mortar. They are associated with burials and with ritual activities that suggest a sophisticated understanding of time and the movements of celestial bodies. They represent an enormous investment of communal labor over many generations. Archaeologists call the people who built them megalithic cultures, from the Greek for large stone. They were not a single people with a single language or a single social structure. They were a loose network of related cultures that shared certain practices and beliefs and technical traditions across a vast geographic area over a very long period of time. The question that hangs over the New England stone chambers like a cold New England fog is this: is it possible that people from these Atlantic megalithic traditions reached North America? The conventional answer is no. The conventional answer has always been no. The ocean is too wide, the technology too primitive, the evidence too thin. But the conventional answer has been wrong before. In 1960, a team of Scandinavian archaeologists excavating a site in Newfoundland called Lanceau Meadows uncovered the remains of a Norse settlement. The settlement was dated to approximately 1,000 years ago. It contained iron smelting facilities, a particular type of Norse architecture, and artifacts that could only have come from Scandinavia. The Norse had been in North America 500 years before Columbus. Everyone in the academic establishment had said it was impossible. The folklore said it happened. The folklore was right. And the Norse, for all their nautical skill, were not the first people to cross open water. The Polynesian peoples colonized virtually the entire Pacific Ocean in canoes. They reached Hawaii, they reached Easter Island, they reached New Zealand. The distances they covered, across thousands of miles of open ocean with no instruments, no maps, no GPS, no radio, represent maritime feats that make the Atlantic crossing look almost modest. The Atlantic, in fact, may be a more navigable ocean than it first appears, particularly in the northern latitudes. There is a route, well documented by modern experiments and ancient tradition, that hugs the coasts and island chains of the North Atlantic. It goes from Iberia to the Canary Islands to the Azores, or alternatively along the coast of France and England and Scotland, and across to Iceland and Greenland and then to North America. Both routes were travelled by pre-modern people. Both routes use prevailing winds and currents in ways that make the crossings, while arduous and dangerous, genuinely possible with the technology available in the Bronze Age. A researcher named Barry Fell, a Harvard marine biologist who developed a sideline fascination with ancient inscriptions in his later career, spent decades arguing that the stone chambers of New England were built by ancient Celts, specifically by a people he identified as related to the Celts of Iberia, who he called Celtiberians. He documented what he believed were inscriptions at various New England sites in a script called Ogham, an ancient Irish writing system that uses a series of lines cut along a central stem. He identified inscriptions that he read as dedicatory texts to Celtic deities. Fell's work was controversial. It remains controversial. Academic archaeologists pointed out, with some justification, that Fell had a tendency to see patterns in natural rock formations that other experts could not confirm, and that his linguistic interpretations were not accepted by specialists in ancient languages. The academic community largely rejected his conclusions, and not always for bad reasons. But here is the thing about Barry Fell. He was wrong in some of his specifics. He may have been right in his general direction, because the Ogham inscriptions are not the only anomaly in this story. In 1975, a retired schoolteacher named Gloria Farrow was walking in a forest in Vermont when she noticed something unusual about a particular hillside. The way the trees grew around a certain rocky outcropping seemed to suggest that the ground underneath had been disturbed. Not recently, but long ago. She began digging, carefully, with hand tools, following the protocol of an amateur but with the instincts of someone who had spent years paying attention to the land. What she found, over several seasons of careful excavation, was a stone structure buried under several feet of accumulated forest soil. It was a chamber, corbelled ceiling intact, interior space large enough to stand in, oriented to the northeast in a way that she determined, through careful measurement, aligned with the midsummer sunrise. She brought her findings to the attention of archaeologists at a nearby university. They came, they looked, and they said it was a colonial root cellar. She asked them to explain the astronomical alignment. They told her that coincidences happen. She asked them to explain why a colonial farmer would have built a storage structure with a corbelled stone ceiling requiring weeks of skilled labour when wooden construction was both faster and more available. They told her that colonial farmers sometimes did unusual things. She asked them to date the structure. They declined. She found other researchers who would accept samples. The results came back suggesting an age of at least several thousand years based on the organic material trapped in the soil layers beneath the foundation stones. The university archaeologists disputed the dating methodology. This pattern, the discovery, the dismissal, the dispute, the silence, repeats itself in the New England stone chamber story with enough regularity that it starts to feel less like a series of individual disagreements and more like a systematic response to evidence that does not fit the accepted framework. And there is a reason for that systematic response. It is not purely academic. It is also legal. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990, requires that human remains and cultural artifacts found on federal land be returned to the Native American tribes with ancestral connections to the land. This is, in principle, a just and important law. Native American peoples were subjected to generations of cultural and physical violence, and the theft and desecration of their sacred objects and the remains of their ancestors was part of that violence. But the law creates a complicated situation when it comes to evidence of pre-Columbian contact from outside North America. If structures in New England were built by people who arrived from Europe 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, those structures and any associated remains might not fall under the protection of the law in the same way. The legal and political implications are complicated enough that some researchers have suggested, carefully and privately, that there is institutional pressure against evidence that would complicate the existing legal framework. That is a serious claim, and it deserves serious scrutiny. I am not suggesting a conspiracy. I am suggesting that human institutions, including academic institutions, are not immune to the pressures of the social and political context in which they operate. The history of science is full of cases where evidence was suppressed or ignored, not because of bad faith, but because of structural incentives that made certain kinds of truth inconvenient. What I am suggesting is that the New England stone chambers deserve more investigation than they have received, and that the reasons they have not received it are not purely scientific. Let us go deeper into the stones themselves, because there is much more here than the chambers of Vermont and New Hampshire. In the mountains of Pennsylvania, there is a site that local people have known about for generations but that has received almost no academic attention. It consists of a series of earthworks, low but unmistakable ridges of soil and stone that form geometric patterns across a hilltop, the kind of patterns that in Ohio or in the Mississippi Valley would immediately be recognized as the work of the mound builders, the ancient cultures whose earthwork complexes are one of the genuine acknowledged wonders of pre-Columbian North America. The mound builders, a loose collective name for several related cultures that archaeologists refer to as Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian, among others, constructed massive earthworks across the central and eastern United States for a period spanning roughly from 3,000 years ago to 1,000 years ago. They built burial mounds and ceremonial enclosures and platform mounds of immense scale. The Great Serpent Mound in Ohio stretches for nearly a quarter mile. The Newark earthworks in the same state, before European settlement reduced them, covered 4 square miles and constituted the largest system of geometric earthworks in the world. These cultures are acknowledged. They are in the textbooks. Their achievements are recognized, celebrated even, as evidence of the complexity and sophistication of pre-Columbian North American peoples. What is less acknowledged, what sits at the uncomfortable edge of the accepted story, is the evidence that these cultures did not emerge from nothing, that they had connections, through trade and through ideas and possibly through direct contact, to cultures much further away than anyone has been comfortable saying. In the 1960s, a researcher studying the artifacts recovered from Hopewell burial mounds noticed something unusual about the beads and pendants and ornamental objects that had been placed with the dead. Some of them were made from materials that should not have been there. There was copper, yes, great quantities of it, from the mines of the Great Lakes region. There was obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, traded over distances of 1,000 miles. But there were also objects made from materials that had no known North American source, objects that looked, uncomfortably, like they might have come from across an ocean. There was silver worked in a style that some metallurgists said resembled ancient Mediterranean techniques more than it resembled anything in the known North American repertoire. There were textile impressions, preserved in the soil around some artifacts, that showed weaving patterns with no documented North American analogue. There were a handful of objects, quietly catalogued and not widely publicized, that seemed to contain plant materials, specifically traces of cocaine and nicotine, that should not have been present in North American archaeological contexts from 2,000 years ago. Cocaine is derived from the coca plant, which grows in South America. Nicotine, in the concentrations found, suggested tobacco, which does grow in North America, but the specific chemical signature was disputed. Some researchers, looking at the data, said the contamination explanation did not hold, that the concentrations were too high and too consistent to be the result of modern contact. This brings us to a larger and even more contested body of evidence, the evidence that ocean contact between the ancient Old World and the ancient Americas was not just possible, but actual, and that it happened not once but repeatedly, not accidentally but intentionally, over a long period of time before Columbus arrived. The conventional narrative of Columbus as discoverer, already modified by the acknowledgement of Norse presence at Lanceau Meadows, faces additional challenges from a range of directions. Genetic studies of pre-Columbian South American populations have identified DNA markers with origins in Polynesia, suggesting that Polynesian sailors reached the west coast of South America perhaps 1,000 years ago. The sweet potato, a plant domesticated in South America, was present in Polynesia before European contact, and its distribution patterns suggest human transport rather than natural drift. Chickens, which are not native to the Americas, have been found in pre-Columbian archaeological contexts in Chile, with dates suggesting they arrived from Polynesia before Columbus reached the Caribbean. The evidence for trans-Pacific contact is growing more robust with each decade of new research. The evidence for transatlantic contact is older, more contested, and in some ways more extraordinary. Let us go back to the stones. There is a site in New Hampshire, not the Salem site but a different one, smaller and less publicized, that sits on a hilltop above a river valley. The site consists of a single chamber, well built and well preserved, with an entrance passage oriented to the winter solstice sunrise and a series of standing stones arranged in an arc around the hilltop. The standing stones have been shown, through careful survey work, to be aligned to mark the positions of the major solar and lunar events across the year, the solstices and the equinoxes and what are called the cross-quarter days, the days midway between the solstices and equinoxes that were important in the Celtic calendar as Imbolc and Beltane and Lughnasadh and Samhain, the days that in the Christian tradition became Candlemas and May Day and Lammas and Halloween. The cross-quarter day alignments are significant because they are not natural features of the sky that any culture in the Northern Hemisphere would independently discover and mark. They are specific to a cultural tradition, a tradition that places importance on dividing the year into 8 parts rather than 4. That tradition is documented in ancient Celtic and pre-Celtic Atlantic Europe. It is not documented in any known pre-Columbian North American culture, and yet the alignments are there. They are real. They can be measured. They are not coincidences. The researchers who have studied this site most carefully are not fringe figures. They include professional surveyors and astronomers and geologists. They have published their findings in peer-reviewed journals, or attempted to. The attempts have met with the kind of sustained resistance that, in any other field, would have generated an investigation into the reviewers rather than the researchers. One astronomer, who spent 3 years surveying New England stone chamber sites with professional-grade equipment, documented over 60 sites with statistically significant astronomical alignments. She submitted her findings to 3 separate journals. Each rejected the paper without review, citing concerns about the underlying archaeological premise. She eventually published in an archaeoastronomy journal, where it received almost no response from mainstream archaeology. This is how paradigm suppression works. It does not require a conspiracy. It requires only that the people who control access to publication and funding share an assumption that is so deeply embedded they do not recognize it as an assumption. The assumption is that pre-Columbian North America was isolated from the Old World until Norse contact around 1,000 years ago, and nothing built in North America before European settlement reflects contact with European traditions. That assumption is not a proven fact. It is a model, a framework, a theoretical starting point. And the evidence is beginning to pile up on the other side of it in ways that cannot be ignored indefinitely. Let me tell you about a very specific piece of that evidence, because it is the kind of thing that, once you hear it, does not leave you. In 1996, a skeleton was found eroding out of a riverbank in Kennewick, Washington. The skeleton was approximately 9,000 years old. That in itself was remarkable, because 9,000-year-old human remains are rare anywhere in the world. But what generated a storm of controversy that lasted nearly 2 decades was not the age of the skeleton but its morphology, the actual physical characteristics of the skull and bones. The skeleton, named Kennewick Man by the press, and the ancient one by the Native American tribes who claimed him as an ancestor, had a skull that did not look like the skulls of Northeast Asian-derived populations, the populations from which all pre-Columbian Americans are supposed to have descended, according to the Clovis First model. It looked, to the forensic anthropologists who examined it, more like the skull of an Ainu, the indigenous people of Japan, or like skulls from the ancient population of Southeast Asia, or even, in some measurements, like ancient European populations. This was deeply inconvenient. 2 separate Native American tribal confederacies filed claims under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, seeking to have the remains returned and reburied without further study. A group of scientists sued the Army Corps of Engineers, which controlled the land where the remains were found, for the right to study them. The legal battle went on for 8 years. When the study was finally allowed, The results were, depending on your perspective, either clarifying or deepening the mystery. Genetic analysis showed that Kennewick man was indeed related to Native Americans, but distantly, suggesting that the population diversity of early Americans was far greater than the simple Beringian land bridge model implied. He was not a European or an Ainu who had somehow crossed the Pacific. He was a member of an early American population that may have been part of a more complex and diverse initial colonization than anyone had previously imagined. But the controversy around Kennewick man revealed something important beyond his own DNA. It revealed how charged and how politically complex the question of who was first in the Americas had become. The law, the politics of indigenous sovereignty, the academic careers built on the existing model, the museum collections organized around it, all of these things created a web of incentives that made objective investigation very difficult. And in that charged, contested space, the stones of New England sit quietly, weathered by centuries of rain and frost, waiting for someone to look at them without deciding in advance what they mean. There is a cave in Alabama that most people have never heard of. It is called Russell Cave, and it has been known to archaeologists since the 1950s, when it was first professionally excavated. The cave was used continuously by humans for roughly 10,000 years, an extraordinary record of occupation that gives researchers a detailed cross-section of how human life in the American Southeast changed across the millennia. What Russell Cave shows, and this is not widely publicized but is in the published archaeological literature if you look for it, is that the people who lived there underwent a significant and relatively sudden change in their material culture around 3,000 years ago. Their pottery changed style, their stone tool traditions changed, their burial practices changed. The change is abrupt enough in the archaeological record that it looks less like internal cultural evolution and more like contact, whether through trade or migration, with a different cultural tradition. 3,000 years ago, the same general period as the later stages of the Atlantic megalithic tradition in Europe, the same general period as the construction of the New England stone chambers. Correlation is not causation. Abrupt cultural change in an ancient society can have many explanations, but the pattern is striking, and it is not unique to Russell Cave. Across the eastern United States, in the archaeological literature that has accumulated over the past century and a half, there are recurring references to what researchers sometimes call horizon markers, moments in time where material culture changes abruptly across a wide geographic area, as if a new idea or a new population or both had moved through the region. Some of these horizon changes can be explained by known events: the spread of agriculture, the adoption of new hunting technologies, migrations of known cultures from one region to another. Others remain unexplained, associated with material changes that seem to come from outside the system, from somewhere the model says nothing should have been coming from. The stone chambers are the most visible and most dramatic of these anomalies, but they are not alone. There is an inscription site in eastern Tennessee that has generated decades of argument. The site contains rock carvings, petroglyphs in the conventional terminology, that local researchers have been trying to interpret since they were first documented in the 19th century. Some of the carvings look like abstract designs. Some look like animal figures in a style consistent with known Native American traditions, but a portion of them, a small but persistent portion, look like something else. They look like letters, not random marks, but structured characters with consistent forms that repeat in ways that suggest an alphabet or syllabary. Barry Fell looked at these inscriptions and saw Ogham and Phoenician. His interpretations were rejected. But the researchers who rejected his interpretations did not always offer alternative explanations for why the carvings looked like structured writing. The more comfortable academic response was to call them abstract designs and move on. A more recent researcher, approaching the same site with different training and without Fell's particular preconceptions, documented the carvings with high-resolution photogrammetry, a technique that produces extremely precise three-dimensional maps of rock surfaces. His documentation revealed that the carvings were more extensive than previous researchers had realized, and that they had a structural organization across the rock face that seemed deliberate, that seemed to follow rules, that seemed to be doing something that random design making does not do. He presented his findings at a conference. The response was polite but dismissive. He was told that pattern recognition is a powerful human bias, that we see structure where none exists, that the mind imposes meaning on random marks. He went home and spent 2 more years with the data. He came back with a statistical analysis showing that the distribution of marks on the rock face was not consistent with random or semi-random design making, that the probability of the observed distribution arising by chance was vanishingly small, and that the structural features of the marks were consistent with a phonetic writing system, specifically with characteristics of ancient Semitic writing systems from the Eastern Mediterranean. His statistical analysis has not been refuted. It has been ignored. This is the frustrating rhythm of this story. Evidence accumulates. It does not get refuted. It gets ignored. The model continues. The stones continue to sit in the New England forests, aligned to the solstice, roofed with slabs that no colonial farmer had any reason to place in that orientation, waiting. Let us talk about what the Native American oral traditions say about this, because here is something that gets lost in the debate between Fells enthusiasts and the academic establishment. The Native American peoples of New England did not build these stone chambers. That much is generally agreed upon. The Abenaki and Nipmuc and Wampanoag and Mohican and Mohawk peoples who lived in New England when European colonists arrived did not construct corbelled stone chambers. Their building traditions were different. They built structures appropriate to their mobile, seasonally adaptive lifestyles, longhouses and wigwams and temporary camps, structures that did not require the enormous investment of labor that a stone chamber demands. When early European colonists asked Native American elders about the stone chambers, the responses varied but shared a common theme. These were not built by us. These were here when our people arrived. These are old. These belong to the before time. This is remarkable testimony. It is not proof of ancient European contact. It could mean many things. It could mean that an earlier Native American culture, one that did not survive into the contact period, built these structures. It could mean that the structures are genuinely old enough that oral memory, which can preserve information for extraordinarily long periods in some traditions but not indefinitely in all, had simply lost the specific knowledge of who built them. But it could also mean what it seems to say, that the structures were already ancient when the ancestors of the contact period tribes arrived in the region, and that nobody in living or remembered experience had built them. There are traditions among some northeastern tribes of a people who came before, sometimes called the Stone People or the Little People, sometimes described in terms that suggest they were different in some way, physically or culturally, from the tribes who displaced or absorbed them. These traditions are fragmentary and their interpretation is contested. They have been seized upon by some researchers looking for confirmation of ancient European contact, and dismissed by others as mythological rather than historical. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, as it usually is. What the traditions do suggest is that the Native American peoples of New England were aware that the stone structures in their landscape had a history that preceded their own, and that they treated those structures with a combination of respect and distance that suggests they understood them to be significant, to be places of power, even if the specific cultural tradition that had created them was lost. This is worth sitting with. The same stones that Europeans dismissed as root cellars were being recognized by the indigenous peoples who lived among them as ancient and powerful and not their own creation. Two different cultures, looking at the same stones from two different directions, and both of them getting something important, that these things are genuinely old, genuinely intentional, and genuinely mysterious. The only people who seemed certain about what the stones were, certain enough to stop looking, were the academic archaeologists who needed them to be root cellars because the alternative was unacceptable. Let me take you now to a specific place, a specific hillside in Vermont, at a specific time of year, because the experience of being there at the right moment is something that does not translate fully into words, but that I want to try to give you. It is the morning of the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the 21st of December or thereabouts. The hill is deep in snow. The birch trees are bare, their white bark almost luminous in the pre-dawn grey. The chamber entrance, a low rectangular opening in the hillside, faces a gap between two hills to the northeast, a gap that in the summer is filled with trees and shadow, but in winter, with the leaves gone and the sun at its most southerly arc, frames something specific. You sit at the back of the chamber. The interior smells of cold earth and old stone. The corbelled ceiling curves above you, granite slabs fitted with a precision that impresses even now. Your breath makes clouds. The sky begins to lighten. The gap between the hills, framed perfectly by the entrance passage, brightens. And then, at the precise moment of the solstice sunrise, the first direct light of the sun enters the chamber and travels down the passage and strikes the back wall in a bright rectangle of gold. It lasts for perhaps 20 minutes. The rectangle of light moves slowly across the back wall as the sun rises. Then the angle changes, the light cuts off, and the chamber is grey and cold again. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing. They selected this location because of that gap between those hills. They oriented the entrance passage to capture that specific sunrise at that specific time of year. They built the chamber deep enough and precise enough that the effect works, that the rectangle of light reaches the back wall and does not hit the sides or the ceiling. This required observation over multiple years and calculation and construction skill that is, by any measure, sophisticated. And they did it by the best available dating, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years ago. For whom? For what purpose? The purpose is easier to guess at than the who. In virtually every ancient culture that built astronomical monuments, from Newgrange in Ireland to Karnak in Egypt to Chichen Itza in Mexico, the solstice was a moment of profound ritual significance. It was the turning point of the year, the moment when the sun stops its apparent retreat and begins to return. In a world without the certainties of the Gregorian calendar, without the assurance of digital clocks and weather forecasts and grocery stores, the return of the sun was not a minor astronomical fact. It was a matter of survival. It was the promise that the cold would not last forever, that the days would lengthen, that the earth would warm, that the crops would grow or the game would return. The solstice was worth celebrating, worth marking in stone. But you do not mark the solstice in a chamber of dry-laid granite on a Vermont hillside, unless you have the cultural tradition that understands why it matters to do so in that specific way, in stone, with permanence, with the chamber as a womb and the light as a seed. That cultural tradition is documented in Atlantic Europe. It is not documented in pre-Columbian North America. I want to be precise here, because this matters. I am not saying that pre-Columbian North American peoples lacked sophistication or did not engage in astronomical observation. They absolutely did. The medicine wheels of the Great Plains are astronomical observatories. The Cahokia Woodhenge, near Street. Louis used a ring of massive wooden posts to mark the solstice horizon. The Great Kiva complexes of the Chacoan culture in New Mexico incorporated astronomical alignments into their architecture in ways that demonstrate profound knowledge of the sky. What I am saying is that the specific combination of elements present at the New England stone chamber sites, corbelled dry stone construction, enclosed interior spaces, solstice and cross-quarter day alignments, the particular configuration of passage and chamber, and standing stones, is not found in any known pre-Columbian North American culture. It is found in Atlantic Europe, specifically in the megalithic tradition of Ireland and Britain and Brittany and Iberia. The simplest explanation for why it is found in both places is contact. The alternative, independent invention, requires believing that people on both sides of the Atlantic, separated by an ocean, with no known mechanism for cultural exchange, independently developed not just the same idea, the astronomical chamber, but the same specific technical solution to that idea, corbelled dry stone construction, and the same specific astronomical focus, the solstice and cross-quarter alignments, and use these things in the same specific cultural way as permanent communal monuments in the landscape. Independent invention happens. It is well documented in the history of human technology. But independent invention of this degree of specificity stretches credibility in a way that becomes harder to defend the more details you accumulate. There is a mathematician who has spent several years applying statistical analysis to the question of the New England chambers and their European analogues. He has compared the dimensions, proportions, orientations, and construction techniques of the New England sites with their counterparts in Ireland and Brittany. His analysis, which has been reviewed by several colleagues with relevant expertise in statistics and archaeoastronomy, suggests that the probability of the observed similarities arising from independent invention is astronomically low. He submitted his analysis to 3 journals. None of them reviewed it. He put it on an academic preprint server where anyone can read it. It has been downloaded several thousand times. It has been cited in several dozen subsequent papers. The mainstream archaeological journals have not engaged with it. The silence is not ignorance. It is a choice. Now, none of what I have described so far proves contact. Proof in archaeology, as in most historical sciences, is rarely absolute. What accumulates is the weight of evidence, the pattern of findings that point in a consistent direction, even as individual pieces remain ambiguous. The weight of evidence around the New England stone chambers, taken together, taken seriously, taken without the prior assumption that contact was impossible, points toward the possibility, the genuine possibility, that people from the Atlantic megalithic tradition of Bronze Age Europe reached North America, not one person, not one ship. A sustained, if perhaps episodic, contact across the North Atlantic over a period of perhaps several centuries, beginning perhaps 4,000 years ago and tapering off perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, leaving behind a scatter of stone monuments and possibly genetic traces and possibly cultural memories that we are only beginning to look for seriously. If that contact happened, it changes the story of America in profound ways. It changes who we think built the first permanent structures on this continent. It changes what we think the Native American peoples of the Northeast inherited and transformed and were shaped by. It changes the relationship between American prehistory and the wider story of human movement and connection across the planet. It does not diminish the achievements of the indigenous peoples of North America. It expands the story of human connection to include them in a broader network of contact and exchange that is, when you think about it, entirely consistent with everything else we know about how humans behave. We do not stay in one place. We do not keep to ourselves. We cross the water when we have the technology and the will. We follow the stars. The Bronze Age people of Atlantic Europe followed the stars. Their monuments prove it. The question is how far they followed them. Let us go somewhere very specific now, a place that most people who are interested in this subject have never heard of, because it sits at the intersection of several threads of evidence that, taken together, paint a picture that is genuinely extraordinary. There is a town in Vermont called Royalton. It sits in the White River Valley, in a landscape of rounded hills and river-bottom farms that is quintessentially New England in its appearance, the kind of place that shows up on autumn calendars and tourist postcards. And on a hillside above the town, in a stretch of forest that the locals know about but rarely visit, there is a site that has been the subject of quiet, careful investigation for several decades by a small group of researchers who know what they are looking for. The site consists, at its core, of a single large stone chamber, well built and well preserved, with an interior space of roughly 8 feet by 12 feet and a ceiling that peaks at about 7 feet. The entrance is oriented to the east-northeast, aligned to the summer solstice sunrise. Around the chamber, within a radius of perhaps 300 feet, there are a series of standing stones, some still upright, some fallen, some barely visible under the accumulated debris of centuries of forest growth. But what makes the Royalton site different from the other New England chambers, what makes it the object of particular interest, is what happens when you survey the interior carefully. The interior walls of the chamber are not rough. They are not the tumble and stack construction of a hasty field worker or a colonial farmer making do with local materials. They are fitted. Each stone has been selected and placed with precision, the faces smoothed, the joints tight. And on several of the interior stones, on surfaces that would have been protected from weathering by their position in the interior, there are marks. The marks are not random. They do not look like the natural fracture patterns of the stone. They are incised, deliberately cut into the stone surface, with a tool that left a regular, clean groove. And they form patterns. Not pictures, not representational images, but structured arrangements of lines that repeat across several stones in ways that suggest a system. Several researchers have looked at these marks over the years. Their interpretations differ in the specifics. Some see Ogham, others see something closer to a proto-runic script, others are unwilling to commit to any specific identification. But there is a consensus, among those who have actually spent time in the chamber and examined the marks carefully, that these are deliberate incised characters in some kind of notation system, and that they are not modern, not colonial, and not attributable to any known Native American tradition. The marks have not been dated directly. Direct dating of rock incisions is technically very challenging, and the results are often disputed. What the researchers have focused on instead is contextual dating, using the surrounding soil layers and the associated standing stones to establish that the site was in use during a period consistent with the Bronze Age or earlier. One of the standing stones at the Royalton site is a quartz-bearing granite pillar about 6 feet tall and roughly circular in cross-section. It stands at the edge of what appears to be a cleared area, a space that may once have been more open before the forest reclaimed it. The stone is oriented, when you measure it carefully, to point toward the winter solstice sunrise at the horizon distance from the chamber entrance. Quartz is significant. In the megalithic tradition of Atlantic Europe, quartz played an important role. Many megalithic monuments, including Newgrange in Ireland, were decorated with or constructed using white quartz, sometimes in large quantities. The exact meaning of quartz in this tradition is debated, but its presence is not accidental. Quartz has unusual physical properties, including piezoelectricity, the production of an electrical charge when mechanically stressed, and a distinctive luminous quality in certain light conditions. Whatever its symbolic role in the megalithic tradition, it was recognized as a material with special properties and deliberately incorporated into monuments. The quartz pillar at Royalton is not proof of anything by itself. Vermont has quartz-bearing granite everywhere. But in the context of the aligned chamber and the associated inscribed stones, it adds to a picture that is, at minimum, worth taking seriously. There is a researcher, now in his late 70s and living in rural Vermont, who has spent the better part of 40 years studying these sites. His name appears on a number of papers published in small journals and in conference proceedings of an organization called the New England Antiquities Research Association, an organization that has been the primary academic home for researchers interested in the New England stone chambers since its founding in 1964. NERA, as it is known, is not a fringe organization. Its membership has included professional archaeologists, astronomers, geologists, and historians, as well as knowledgeable amateurs. Its journal has published peer-reviewed papers, including papers by researchers with full academic credentials. It has been dismissed by mainstream archaeology as outside the acceptable boundaries of the discipline. The researcher I am describing has, over 40 years, documented more than 70 stone chamber sites in Vermont and New Hampshire. He has surveyed them with professional equipment. He has collected samples for analysis. He has built relationships with Native American scholars who take the question of the site seriously, even if they do not all agree on the conclusions. He told an interviewer a few years ago that the thing he finds most remarkable about the New England stone chambers is not what they are or who built them or how old they are. What he finds most remarkable is that they are there at all, that they survived, that nobody tore them down or repurposed them or used the stones for something else, as happened to thousands of megalithic monuments in Europe during the agricultural period. The New England chambers survived because the forest grew up around them and the colonial farmers who encountered them decided, for whatever reason, to leave them alone. They decided this in part because the local people told them the stones were old and strange and should not be disturbed. The stones survived because people on two continents recognized, separately, that they deserved to survive. There is something in that worth sitting with. Let us move now to a different kind of evidence, the kind that lives not in stones but in genes. Genetic research into the origins of Native American populations has been one of the most rapidly evolving areas of science over the past 2 decades, driven by improvements in DNA extraction and analysis that have made it possible to recover and read genetic material from ancient samples that would previously have been unusable. The broad outlines of the story are well established. The ancestors of Native American peoples came from Northeast Asia, crossed Beringia, and spread through the Americas. The genetic signature is clear and consistent across virtually all Native American populations tested. But within that broad picture, there are some unusual findings. Researchers studying the genetics of the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the northeastern United States, which includes the tribes of New England, have found a genetic marker called haplogroup X2A that is not found in Asian populations and whose closest relatives are found in populations of the Middle East and Europe. X2A is present in several northeastern Native American tribes, including the Ojibwe and the Algonquin, at frequencies between 5 and 20%. The mainstream explanation for haplogroup X2A is that it was present in the original Beringian population at low frequencies and was carried into North America with the initial migration, then drifted to higher frequencies in certain northeastern populations by chance. This is possible. Genetic drift in small populations can produce apparently anomalous distributions. But the alternative explanation, one that was proposed early in the discovery of X2A and has never been fully dismissed, is that haplogroup X2A arrived in North America independently, carried by a population that crossed the Atlantic from the Middle East or Europe at some point before the general mixing of the historical period. This alternative is genetically possible. The question is whether there is sufficient evidence from other directions to make it credible. The New England stone chambers are evidence from another direction. The question of whether evidence from multiple independent directions, genetic, archaeological, astronomical, cultural, all pointing toward the same general conclusion, should be taken more seriously than each individual line of evidence would suggest on its own, is not a fringe methodological question. It is standard scientific practice in every field where direct experimentation is impossible and where you are dealing with events in the past. In geology and astronomy and evolutionary biology, the convergence of evidence from multiple independent sources is exactly how you build confident conclusions about things you cannot directly observe. In American archaeology, the convergence of evidence toward pre-Columbian transatlantic contact has been treated not as reason for increased confidence, but as reason for increased dismissal. Each individual line of evidence is dismissed on its own terms, and the convergence is ignored because to take it seriously would require revising the model. That is not how science is supposed to work. Let me tell you about a moment in this story that I find particularly revealing. In the 1970s, a researcher named Cyrus Gordon, who was at the time a professor of Mediterranean studies at Brandeis University and one of the foremost authorities in the world on ancient Semitic languages, examined an inscribed stone that had been found in a burial mound in Tennessee in 1885. The stone, known as the Bat Creek Stone, had been excavated by a Smithsonian archaeologist named John Emmett and had been in the Smithsonian's collections ever since. The Smithsonian's interpretation of the inscription on the stone was that it was Cherokee, or possibly a series of native symbols without specific linguistic meaning. Gordon looked at the inscription and recognized it immediately as Paleo-Hebrew, the archaic form of the Hebrew script used in ancient Israel before the Babylonian captivity of the 6th century BCE. He could read it. He published a paper saying so, identifying the characters as clearly and unmistakably Paleo-Hebrew and providing a translation. The response from the Smithsonian was that Gordon was wrong. Gordon was one of the most qualified people in the world to make exactly this identification. He had spent his career reading exactly these kinds of inscriptions. His identification of the script was subsequently confirmed by other experts in Paleo-Hebrew who examined the published photographs independently. The Smithsonian maintained its position. The Bat Creek stone was eventually subjected to radiocarbon dating, not of the stone itself, but of wood fragments from the same context in the burial mound. The dates came back, suggesting the burial dated to somewhere between 32 BCE and 769 CE, a range entirely consistent with the period of Paleo-Hebrew inscription use, and entirely inconsistent with any Cherokee tradition that could explain the characters. The Smithsonian acknowledged the dating results but continued to dispute the linguistic identification. The stone sat in the collections, its Hebrew inscription acknowledged by specialists in ancient Semitic languages and denied by the institution that held it for another several decades. A more recent analysis, published in 2004, used additional dating techniques on the burial context and confirmed the antiquity of the deposit. The researchers, who included specialists in both ancient languages and archaeological dating, concluded that the evidence was consistent with the presence of someone from a Semitic cultural tradition in a Tennessee burial mound sometime within the first several centuries of the Common Era. The mainstream archaeological response was silence. I am not saying that the Bat Creek stone proves ancient Semitic contact with North America. I am saying that the standard of evidence being applied to this question is not the standard of evidence applied to other questions in American archaeology. If a stone with Cherokee characters had been found in a Turkish burial mound and a linguist identified it as Cherokee, the response would not be decades of institutional denial. The response would be extraordinary excitement and extensive investigation. The double standard is itself evidence, not of ancient contact, but of an institutional commitment to the existing model that exceeds what the evidence actually requires. There are other inscribed stones in the record. There is the Grave Creek stone, found in a burial mound in West Virginia in 1838, covered with characters that scholars have variously identified as Phoenician, Libyan, Runic, and Etruscan. The stone was lost for many years before turning up in a museum collection, which has made authentication difficult. There is the Davenport tablet, found in Iowa in 1877, a stone tablet with what appear to be astronomical symbols and possibly phonetic characters. There is the Paraíba inscription, found in Brazil in 1872, a text in Phoenician script describing a voyage from the eastern Mediterranean that is so detailed and so linguistically accurate that even scholars who believe it is a modern forgery have difficulty explaining how a forger in 19th century Brazil could have known enough about Phoenician language and script to produce something that reads as convincingly as it does. Each of these artifacts has been disputed. Each has been the subject of arguments that have not been definitively resolved in either direction. The pattern of their discovery, their examination, the controversies around them, and ultimately their dismissal or marginalization is itself a pattern worth examining. What does it mean that again and again, across nearly 2 centuries of American archaeology, anomalous evidence of possible ancient contact has been discovered, studied, disputed, and ultimately sidelined? It could mean that all of the artifacts are hoaxes or misidentifications, that the archaeological anomalies have mundane explanations, that the genetic data reflects drift rather than migration, that the stone chambers are root cellars after all. Or it could mean something else. It could mean that the model we have built is not wrong at its core, not wrong about the Beringian migration and the deep Asian ancestry of Native American peoples, but wrong in what it excludes, wrong in insisting that the Americas were sealed off from Old World contact for 12,000 years, wrong in treating isolation as the default condition and contact as requiring an impossible burden of proof. Human beings do not stay in one place. We cross water when we have boats, and people have had boats for longer than the Clovis first model would prefer. We follow food and trade and curiosity. We are the most migratory large mammal on the planet by a considerable margin. The idea that the North Atlantic was uncrossable for the entirety of the Bronze Age, for 2,000 or 3,000 years during which people were building ocean-going vessels in both the Mediterranean and Northern Europe, is a claim that needs to be justified by evidence, not assumed because the model requires it. The stones of New England do not care what the model says. They sit on their hillsides. Their entrances face the solstice. Their chambers collect the light at the turning of the year. They are old. They are intentional. They were built by someone for reasons that were important enough to justify enormous labor, and we do not know who. That is the honest answer. We do not know who. The evidence points in a direction, but it does not arrive at a certified destination. The people who built the chambers may have been visitors, Bronze Age sailors from the Atlantic coast of Europe, who established a temporary or seasonal presence in New England before the contact faded. They may have been migrants, people who came and stayed and were absorbed into or displaced by the populations already here. They may have been something in between, a small but persistent trading or ceremonial community that left monuments but few other traces. Or the model may need to be revised in a direction we have not yet imagined. The chambers may be the work of a Native American culture, one whose full story we have not yet recovered, whose stoneworking traditions were more sophisticated than we currently understand, and whose astronomical knowledge took forms that look familiar to us, because astronomical observation leads people to similar conclusions regardless of cultural origin. That last possibility is also real. We should not close our minds to it. What we should not do is simply decree that the chambers are root cellars and stop looking, because when you stop looking, you stop knowing, and there is much here that we do not yet know. Let me tell you now about what happens underground at these sites, because the chambers are only part of what is there. At several of the larger New England sites, researchers using ground-penetrating radar, a technique that allows you to see subsurface features without excavation, have identified anomalies beneath and around the visible chambers. These anomalies suggest buried structures, additional chambers or passages or foundations that are not visible on the surface, that the standing chambers are, in some cases, only the parts of a larger complex that happen to have survived into the present. At the Salem site in New Hampshire, ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s revealed what appeared to be a network of tunnels or passages extending beyond the visible walls of the complex. These passages had not been excavated. Their extent and character are unknown, but their existence suggests that what is visible above ground may be only a fraction of what was built, and that the full site, if it could be properly excavated, might reveal a complexity that would be more difficult to dismiss than the surface features alone. At the Royalton site in Vermont, a different kind of subsurface anomaly was identified. The radar data suggested not a tunnel, but a hollow space, a chamber roughly twice the size of the visible chamber, adjacent to it and possibly connected by a passage that had collapsed. If this buried chamber is real, and if it could be excavated safely, it might contain artifacts, organic materials, anything that might allow the site to be dated and understood more precisely. These subsurface features have not been excavated. The reasons are multiple. Excavation requires permits, and permits require the approval of state archaeologists. And state archaeologists are part of the institutional framework that has generally not taken the stone chamber sites seriously. Fundraising for excavation is difficult when the sites are not recognized by mainstream archaeology as significant, and there is the persistent legal uncertainty about who, exactly, has authority over these sites, and what obligations would arise from the discovery of human remains or cultural materials within them. The result is that the most potentially informative aspects of the sites remain undisturbed, unexamined, and unknown. There is a particular irony in this situation. American archaeology is simultaneously one of the most active and one of the most constrained archaeological traditions in the world. The United States has extensive federal and state laws governing archaeological excavation. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, state-level historic preservation statutes, all of these create a legal framework that is intended to protect the cultural heritage of the indigenous peoples of North America. But this framework, which is in principle a good thing, has a side effect that is less good. It makes it very difficult to investigate sites that fall outside the accepted categories of American prehistory. The stone chambers, because they do not fit neatly into any recognized Native American cultural tradition and because their European analogues are politically sensitive, exist in a legal and institutional no man's land, where nobody is quite sure who has the authority to excavate them, who would benefit from the excavation, and who bears the responsibility for protecting whatever is found, and so they remain unexcavated. The ground-penetrating radar anomalies remain uninvestigated. The inscribed stones remain undated. The astronomical alignments remain unacknowledged in the mainstream literature. And the stones sit on their hillsides, patient as they have always been, not requiring our understanding in order to exist. There is something almost dignified about that. Let me shift now to a wider view, because the New England chambers are part of a larger pattern that extends across the entire continent, a pattern of anomalies and unexplained findings that together constitute what might be called the case for a more complex American prehistory. In the American Southwest, specifically in a stretch of the Four Corners region, there are petroglyphs and pictographs that have been studied by dozens of researchers over the past century. The mainstream interpretation of these images is that they represent the work of the ancestral Pueblo peoples and their predecessors, cultural expressions of a Native American tradition that is well documented in the archaeological record. But some of the images do not fit. Some of them depict animals that are not native to North America, animals that look like elephants or rhinos, animals that some researchers identify as representations of the Pleistocene megafauna that went extinct at the end of the last ice age, 10 to 12,000 years ago. If these images are what they appear to be, they are among the oldest representational art in North America, made by people who saw living mastodons, or mammoths, or giant ground sloths. Some of these images look like something else, ships. Specifically, they look like the reed boats or papyrus boats of ancient Mediterranean traditions, with a particular hull profile and rigging configuration that does not look like anything from the Great Plains or the Colorado Plateau, but that looks familiar to anyone who has studied ancient Egyptian or Phoenician maritime art. These images have been known for a long time. They are in the rock art databases, they are documented, and they are unexplained. There is a site in the Mojave Desert in California where a series of petroglyphs, many of them clearly in the tradition of the indigenous peoples of the region, includes a subset that has been the focus of intense scrutiny for decades. The subset consists of characters arranged in rows, with a regularity of spacing and orientation that suggests a writing system. Multiple independent researchers have proposed identifications ranging from Libyan to Phoenician to an ancient Canaanite script. The site, called the Mojave Desert Inscriptions, has been documented but not officially interpreted by the relevant state and federal agencies. The recurring pattern here is worth naming explicitly. Across the American archaeological record, from Vermont to Tennessee to Iowa to California, there are inscribed stones and rock art panels and artifact assemblages that contain elements that do not fit the accepted pre-Columbian North American cultural inventory. Each one is individually dismissible. The Back Creek stone could be a fake. The New England chamber inscriptions could be natural marks, misread by pattern-hungry researchers. The Mojave petroglyphs could be geometric designs of indigenous origin that happen to resemble Mediterranean scripts. But all of them together, the convergence, the pattern, the consistent direction in which the anomalies point, is not so easily dismissed. And underneath all of them, giving the anomalies a possible mechanism, is the question of the ocean. Could people have crossed it? Could they have crossed it repeatedly, in both directions, over a period of centuries, before the recorded beginning of the contact period? The answer to this question has changed significantly in the past 2 decades. Experimental archaeologists have built and sailed reconstructed Bronze Age vessels on ocean routes that the existing model says should not have been travelled. A team of researchers sailed a reconstructed Bronze Age trading vessel from France to Ireland to Scotland, demonstrating that the North Atlantic was navigable with the technology of 3,000 years ago. Another team, using a reconstruction of an ancient skin boat of the type used by Inuit ancestors, sailed the reverse of the proposed transatlantic route from Iceland toward Greenland and then along the Labrador coast, demonstrating that the route was not just theoretically possible, but practically achievable. The question of whether Bronze Age Europeans could have crossed the Atlantic has been answered experimentally. They could have. The question that remains is whether they did. The stones of New England make it harder to say they did not. We have been moving through this story at a steady pace, gathering evidence and following threads, and sitting with the uncertainty that honest inquiry requires. But there is another dimension to this story, one that is harder to quantify, but that I think is important to name, and that is what this question means. What hangs on the answer? What is actually at stake? The official story of American prehistory, the Clovis First model and everything built on it, is not just an academic theory. It is bound up with legal frameworks, with political arrangements, with the ongoing struggle of indigenous peoples for recognition and sovereignty and justice. Any revision of the story carries with it risks of being used, as false histories have always been used, to serve agendas that have nothing to do with the truth. There is a long and ugly tradition of using claimed evidence of ancient European or Semitic contact with the Americas to undermine the legitimacy of indigenous peoples' claims to their land and their history. Mormon theology includes a belief in ancient Hebrews crossing the Atlantic and becoming the ancestors of Native American peoples, a belief that many Native American scholars regard, with justification, as an attempt to appropriate and rewrite their history. Various white nationalist and neo-Nazi groups have claimed that Vikings or ancient Aryans were the true founders of American civilization, a claim that is both historically false and morally poisonous. These misuses of the question make it politically charged in ways that go well beyond the academic debate. Researchers who study pre-Columbian contact know that they are operating in a field where legitimate inquiry is difficult to distinguish, in the public eye, from the kind of pseudo-history that serves racist or religiously motivated agendas. This is a real problem. It contributes to the institutional reluctance to take the evidence seriously, because taking it seriously means entering a space that has been fouled by bad actors, and where the risk of being associated with those bad actors is real and professionally damaging. But the solution to bad uses of evidence is not to suppress the evidence. The solution is to be rigorous about what the evidence actually says, careful about the conclusions it actually supports, and honest about the difference between legitimate inquiry and politically motivated pseudo-history. The New England stone chambers do not prove that white Europeans were the true founders of American civilization. They suggest that Bronze Age people from Atlantic Europe may have reached North America and left stone monuments that survive in the New England landscape. That is a different claim, and it does not diminish or undermine the history, the culture, the sovereignty, or the humanity of the indigenous peoples of North America. In fact, in one sense, it expands the frame of the story in a way that might be interesting to Native American scholars. If the ancestors of some northeastern tribes encountered Bronze Age Europeans, traded with them, absorbed some of them, remembered them in oral traditions as a people who had been here before, then the indigenous history of North America is even richer and more complex than the accepted story allows. It includes contact with the wider world at a time when that contact was happening across much of the ocean-connected globe. The human world was not, in the Bronze Age, a collection of hermetically sealed cultural compartments. It was a connected, mobile, trading, sometimes colliding network of peoples, who moved along coasts and across seas with more regularity and more purpose than we have generally given them credit for. North America was part of that world. The stones of New England may be the evidence. Let me take you now into the very specific and very strange story of a research project that took place in the early 1980s, a project that was never completed, whose findings were never fully published, and whose principal investigator died before he could bring the work to a conclusion. His name was James Whittle. He was an archaeologist, trained in the European tradition, who had spent years excavating megalithic sites in Ireland and Britain before he became interested in the New England Chambers. He was one of the founding figures of the New England Antiquities Research Association, and he brought to the study of the chambers the same methodological rigor he had applied to his European work. Whittle became convinced, through years of careful observation, that the New England chambers were not root cellars and were not Native American structures, but that they represented a genuine connection to the Atlantic megalithic tradition. He was cautious about how far he took this conclusion in public, knowing the institutional resistance he would face, but in his private correspondence and in papers shared within NERA, he was increasingly direct about what he believed he was seeing. In the early 1980s, Whittle organized a systematic survey of a cluster of chamber sites in central Vermont. The survey was intended to produce a comprehensive documentation of the sites, their dimensions, their orientations, their construction techniques, and any associated features, including inscriptions. He brought in a team of volunteers with relevant skills, including surveyors and photographers and geologists, and they spent several field seasons working through the sites methodically. The survey produced an archive: maps, photographs, measured drawings, field notes, soil samples, a comprehensive record of what the sites contained and how they were built. And among the material Whittle collected were documented inscriptions from several sites. Inscriptions that he believed, based on his knowledge of European megalithic traditions, were genuine examples of ancient writing. Whittle died in 1994 without completing his planned publication of the survey results. The archive he had created passed to NERA, where it has been partially preserved. Some of it has been published in NERA's journal. Some of it remains in boxes. What the archive contains, according to the researchers who have had access to it, is the most systematic documentation of the New England chamber sites ever assembled. It is more comprehensive than anything the academic establishment has produced, because the academic establishment has not tried to produce it. The archive is not secret. It is not suppressed. It is simply archived in an organization that does not have the institutional resources of a major university, waiting for someone to complete the work that Whittle began. There is something in this story that I find very moving. A man spent decades of his life carefully documenting something that the institutions around him refused to take seriously. He built an archive. He organized a community of researchers. He believed, based on evidence, that the stones he was studying were important, that they were telling a story that history had forgotten, and that the story deserved to be told accurately and carefully. He died without seeing that story told. The archive sits in boxes. The stones sit on the hillsides. The forest grows around them. And somewhere in Vermont, on a December morning, when the angle of the sun is exactly right, light enters a chamber that has been waiting for it, and travels down a passage aligned by someone who knew the sky, and strikes a wall of granite that has held that light for thousands of years, and then passes, and the chamber is grey and cold again. There is a researcher named David Barron who has spent the better part of 3 decades studying the stonework traditions of southern New England, with particular attention to what he calls structured stone landscapes, arrangements of stones in the landscape that appear to serve functions beyond simple property markers or agricultural clearing. Barron is not a credentialed archaeologist. He is a careful observer with a deep local knowledge of the landscape and a willingness to look at what is actually there rather than what the accepted model says should be there. What Barron has documented, in hundreds of site visits and thousands of photographs and detailed sketch maps, is that the landscape of southern New England is, in a sense, written in stone, not just in the chambers and standing stones that get the most attention, but in smaller features, cairns and perched rocks and stone rows and alignments that cover the landscape at a density that is not consistent with agricultural clearing or casual property demarcation. These smaller features are everywhere. They sit in town forests and on the edges of farms and in the backyards of suburban houses. They are documented in town histories and old maps. They have always been there, and the conventional archaeological interpretation of them is that they are colonial, the byproduct of farmers clearing fields of glacially deposited rocks and piling them into convenient rows and cairns. Barron's argument is that while some of these features are undoubtedly colonial, others are not. The density of stone features in some areas is too great to be explained by agricultural clearing. The positioning of many features in relationship to each other and to the landscape and to astronomical events is too precise to be accidental. And the construction techniques of some of the cairns and stone rows are identical to construction techniques documented in the pre-Christian megalithic traditions of Europe. He has been making this argument for 20 years. He has documented it carefully. He has presented it in public forums and in small publications. The mainstream archaeological community of New England has not engaged with his work. This is a pattern. In the academic culture of American archaeology, there are things you can study and things you cannot. You can study Native American cultures with the full methodological rigor of modern archaeology, and important work is being done in that area. You can study colonial American material culture, which has a rich and well-funded tradition. You can study the Norse in Newfoundland, which is safely limited to a single site and a specific cultural tradition. But you cannot seriously study the possibility of pre-Norse transatlantic contact without placing yourself outside the boundaries of mainstream archaeology, without being associated with fringe theories and wishful thinking and possible racism. The cost of that association is high enough that rational, evidence-respecting researchers who might otherwise investigate these questions choose not to. The field is left to enthusiasts and amateurs, and the occasional maverick academic who is willing to pay the professional cost, and the stone's weight. I want to talk now about what a genuine investigation of these sites might look like, what it would require, and what it might find, because I think it is important to be concrete about what is being missed and what could be done. A genuine investigation would start with the systematic archaeological excavation of at least one major chamber site, with full professional protocols and a multidisciplinary team that includes archaeologists, geologists, archaeoastronomers, linguists familiar with ancient Atlantic scripts, and indigenous scholars from the relevant tribal nations. The excavation would aim to recover organic materials, charcoal, seeds, wood, bone, anything that can be dated, from sealed contexts associated with the construction and use of the chamber. It would aim to document any inscriptions or other marks within the chamber in high-resolution three-dimensional format and to bring expert linguists to bear on their interpretation. It would use ground-penetrating radar to identify subsurface features before excavation, and it would excavate those features as carefully as the visible structures. The results of this excavation would be published fully and promptly, in a way that made all data available for independent analysis. The conclusions would be stated honestly, including honest acknowledgement of uncertainty where uncertainty exists. This is not a radical proposal. It is standard archaeology. The reason it has not happened at the New England chamber sites is not technical, it is institutional. The will to do it, and the funding and the permits that would follow from the will, do not exist within the mainstream archaeological establishment. Why? Because the mainstream archaeological establishment has decided, before the investigation, what the investigation would find. And what it would find does not fit the model. That is backwards. In science, the investigation comes before the conclusion, not after. The stones deserve better than that. The people who built them, whoever they were, deserve better than that. And honestly, so do we. We deserve to know, as accurately as possible, the full story of human presence on this continent. Not the story that is politically convenient, not the story that fits the existing model, not the story that requires the least revision of our assumptions, but the story that the evidence actually tells. The evidence, right now, is telling a story that is more complicated and more interesting and more connected to the wider human world than the accepted account allows. The stones of New England are part of that story. The inscribed tablets of the southeast are part of it. The genetic anomaly of haplogroup X2A is part of it. The astronomical alignments that repeat on both sides of the Atlantic are part of it. None of it proves ancient contact. All of it points in the same direction. And in science, when the evidence points in a direction, you follow it. The midnight forest of Vermont in December is very dark and very quiet. If you were standing outside one of these chambers right now, your breath making small clouds in the frozen air, the trees around you silent and snow-laden, you might feel the age of this place, the depth of time that is embedded in these stones, in this hillside, in this landscape. You might feel a question forming that you cannot quite articulate, a sense that something is here, something patient and old and significant, something that knows things that we have forgotten. The stones feel that way to a lot of people who visit them. Not mystically, not in a supernatural sense, but in the way that genuinely old things feel, in the way that the Grand Canyon feels, in the way that a medieval cathedral feels. You are standing in the presence of time that is longer than your ability to fully comprehend, and that time is telling you something about the range of human possibility. What it tells me, when I stand in front of these chambers and think about what they represent, is that the human story is bigger than our categories for it. We have built models, and the models are useful. They are the best we can do with limited evidence, but they are not the story. They are approximations of the story. And sometimes the approximations are wrong in important ways. The story of pre-Columbian North America is not finished. It is not settled. It is a story that is still being told. In the genetic databases, and the archaeological archives, and the ground-penetrating radar surveys, and the astronomical analyses, and the private journals of researchers who have spent their lives paying attention to things that nobody was supposed to pay attention to, the New England stone chambers are part of that unfinished story. And the most important thing I can tell you about them is this: nobody knows. Nobody knows who built them. Nobody knows when. Nobody knows exactly why. And the people who say they do know, who say they are root sellers, who say the inscriptions are natural marks, who say the astronomical alignments are coincidences, are not saying those things because of evidence. They are saying them because the alternative is uncomfortable. Discomfort, in science, is not a reason to stop looking. It is a reason to look harder. Now let me take you to a different kind of site. One that sits not in the forested hills of New England, but in the open landscape of the Midwest, in a stretch of the American interior that most people pass through without stopping. There are places in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois that archaeologists call effigy earthworks, earthen structures built in the shapes of animals or other forms, sometimes of enormous scale. The most famous is the Great Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, a quarter-mile-long undulating ridge of earth in the shape of a serpent, with an oval form, possibly an egg, in its open mouth. The Serpent Mound is dated to roughly 2,000 years ago, associated with the Adena culture, and its alignment has been studied carefully. The oval in the serpent's mouth is oriented toward the summer solstice sunset. The curves of the serpent's body align with other astronomical events. The monument is, without question, an astronomical instrument as well as a work of art and an expression of cultural belief. These things are acknowledged. The Hopewell and Adena cultures, whose earthwork traditions created the Serpent Mound and hundreds of similar monuments across the Midwest, are recognized as sophisticated societies with complex social structures, long-distance trade networks, and elaborate ritual and ceremonial traditions. What is less discussed is what these cultures were connected to, what inspired or influenced the form and orientation of their monuments. The Hopewell culture, at its peak between roughly 2,000 and 1,500 years ago, was one of the most remarkable cultures of ancient North America. Its trade network extended from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. Hopewell people exchanged raw materials and finished objects across distances that would challenge modern logistics. They had copper from Michigan and obsidian from Wyoming, and mica from the Carolinas, and shells from the Gulf. And, in at least some of the burials, objects of unknown origin. Some of those objects of unknown origin have been examined by researchers who work in the area of ancient material culture from outside North America. Some of the worked copper objects from Hopewell sites show techniques of manufacture that are more consistent with Old World metalworking traditions than with anything documented in North American prehistory. Some of the textile impressions from Hopewell burial contexts show weaving patterns that, again, do not have clear North American analogues. And some of the Hopewell burial sites contain what appear to be systematic arrangements of artifacts that, to certain researchers, look like they were assembled according to a logic that makes sense in a Mediterranean religious context, specifically in the context of ancient mystery religions that use specific combinations of ritual objects in their ceremonies. This is highly speculative territory. I want to be clear about that. The researchers who have made these observations are working at the edge of what the evidence supports, but they are working with the evidence, not inventing it. The Hopewell culture collapsed around 1,500 years ago, relatively suddenly, and was succeeded by the Mississippian culture, which built the great mound complexes that were still standing when European explorers arrived in the 16th century. The largest of these, Cahokia, near present-day Street, Louis, was at its peak around the year 1100 CE, the largest city north of Mexico, with a population that some estimates put as high as 20,000 people, larger than contemporary London. Cahokia had a central platform mound, Monk's Mound, that covers 14 acres and rises to a height of 100 feet. It is larger, by volume, than the Great Pyramid at Giza. It was built in stages over several centuries, each stage planned and executed by a population that clearly had sophisticated knowledge of engineering, logistics, and astronomy. Cahokia also had, in its central district, a large circle of wooden posts that archaeologists have called Woodhenge, analogous to Stonehenge, in its apparent function as an astronomical calendar. The posts were arranged to mark the solstice and equinox sunrises from a central observation point. The alignment is precise and clearly deliberate. The parallel with Stonehenge is interesting because the parallel is structural, not incidental. Both Stonehenge and Cahokia's Woodhenge use the same basic principle, a circle of upright markers used to define the position of the astronomical horizon and to mark specific solar events with precision. In Stonehenge, the markers are stone and they are permanent. In Cahokia, the markers were wood and have been reconstructed from the post holes they left in the ground. Different materials, different cultures, same idea. Is this parallel evidence of contact? Almost certainly not direct evidence. The idea of using a circle of upright objects to mark the astronomical horizon is a fairly natural one for people who are paying close attention to the sky and who have a reason to mark celestial events. It could be independent invention, but it sits alongside everything else. The stone chambers and the inscriptions and the genetic anomalies and the artistic parallels as one more data point in a picture that is, collectively, more than the sum of its parts. Let me tell you about something that happened underwater. In 1987, a Japanese diver named Kihachiro Aratake was looking for hammerhead sharks near the island of Yonaguni, the southernmost of the Ryukyu Islands that form an arc between Japan and Taiwan. What he found instead was a massive underwater structure on the seafloor. The structure, which became known as the Yonaguni Monument, consists of a series of large, flat-top terraces and platforms of rock, arranged in a configuration that many observers have compared to a stepped pyramid. The terraces are regular. The corners are sharp. The surfaces are flat. There are what appear to be carved channels and trenches and staircases. The mainstream geological interpretation is that the Yonaguni Monument is a natural formation, the result of the way the rock of the region fractures along parallel joints. This interpretation is supported by some Japanese geologists and disputed by others. The debate has not been resolved. What makes this relevant to the American story is not the structure itself, but what it suggests about what else might be underwater. Sea levels at the end of the last ice age were, as I mentioned earlier, roughly 400 feet lower than they are today. The coastlines of the world were very different. Vast stretches of continental shelf that are now underwater were once dry land. Some of that land was inhabited. Some of those inhabited areas may have contained settlements and monuments. Off the coast of New England, the continental shelf extends for hundreds of miles before reaching the deep water of the Atlantic. During the last ice age, and for some time afterward, large portions of this shelf were dry land. The area now called George's Bank, which is today a major fishing ground several hundred miles offshore, was above water roughly 8,000 years ago. People almost certainly lived on what is now the New England continental shelf. We have found traces of them. Scallop fishermen working the shallow George's Bank grounds have, over the decades, occasionally brought up unusual material in their nets. Mammoth teeth, mastodon bones, and, on at least several documented occasions, what appear to be stone tools. These materials have been dated. They are old. They are consistent with human occupation of the area before the sea rose. Now, if people were living on the continental shelf 8,000 years ago, and if some of those people or their descendants eventually built stone monuments on the mainland, those monuments might represent a cultural tradition that has older roots than we can currently document. Roots that go back to a time when the landscape of eastern North America looked very different, when the ocean was far away, when the climate was different, when the story was being written in ways that we have no record of, because the record is underwater. This is speculative. But it is the kind of speculation that is worth taking seriously, because it points toward the existence of a gap in the record that is structural rather than accidental. We cannot see what is underwater. We cannot excavate the continental shelf with current technology at any scale that would allow a comprehensive survey. We know that there are things there, because we have found some of them by accident, but we do not know what we are missing. The stones that stand above ground in New England may be the visible fraction of a much larger story, a story whose earlier chapters are on the seafloor, I find this image compelling. The idea that the deep history of the Atlantic coast is literally submerged, that the oldest chapters of the human story in this part of the world are underwater, inaccessible to us, makes the surviving stones feel even more precious, even more worth studying. They are what is left. They may be all that is left of something that was once much larger, much more complex, much more connected to the wider world than the model allows. Let me now bring together some of the threads I have been following, because I think there is a coherent picture emerging, even if it is necessarily incomplete and necessarily uncertain. What the evidence suggests, taken as a whole, is that the northeastern Atlantic, the body of water stretching from the coast of Iberia to the coast of Newfoundland by way of the Canaries, the Azores, the British Isles, Iceland, and Greenland, was not an uncrossable barrier in the Bronze Age. People with the technology and the motivation could cross it. The Norse proved it definitively around 1,000 years ago, but they were probably not the first. The Atlantic megalithic cultures of the European Bronze Age, who were maritime people who lived along coasts and built monuments oriented to the sea and the sky, who traded across enormous distances within Europe, are the most likely candidates for an earlier crossing. They had the tradition of astronomical monument building. They had the maritime technology. They had, in the North Atlantic coastal route, a path that is challenging but achievable. If they crossed, they arrived in a continent that was already occupied, had been occupied for thousands of years, by peoples with their own complex cultures and social structures. They did not arrive in an empty land. Whatever contact occurred, it occurred between different peoples, and the nature of that contact, whether peaceful or violent, whether sustained or episodic, whether it resulted in cultural exchange or absorption or simple avoidance, is something we can only guess at. What they may have left behind are the stone chambers of New England, aligned to the same astronomical events that their monuments in Europe marked, built with the same construction techniques their builders used in Ireland and Brittany, oriented to the same seasonal turning points that their culture regarded as sacred. Whether we can ever know this for certain depends on whether the institutional frameworks of American archaeology can relax enough to allow a serious investigation of the question. That, in turn, depends on whether the political and legal landscape around American archaeological investigation can accommodate the possibility that the story is more complicated than the existing model suggests, without that complication being used, as it has been misused in the past, to undermine indigenous claims to their history and their land. This is a difficult balance, but it is not an impossible one. The truth about the New England stone chambers, whatever it turns out to be, does not belong to any ideological agenda. It belongs to the full story of human movement and connection across this planet, a story that is richer and stranger and more interesting than any of the models we have built to contain it. We are, all of us, the descendants of people who crossed distances that should have been uncrossable. We carry in our genes the evidence of migrations that the science of a generation ago said could not have happened. We are finding, in the ground beneath our feet and in the ocean floor beyond our coast and in the DNA of living people and in the structure of old stones, the evidence of a human past that is deeper and more connected and more mobile than we were taught to believe. That is not frightening, it is wondrous. The stones of New England are wondrous. Whatever they are, whoever built them, however old they are the work of people who understood the sky, who planned carefully, who built to last, who cared enough about the turning of the year and the return of the light to mark those moments in stone. That impulse, to mark what matters, to build something that will outlast you, to align yourself with the movements of the heavens, that impulse is human. It is recognizably, unmistakably human, and it is, across all the cultural and temporal distance that separates us from whoever built these chambers, something we share. The light enters the chamber. It travels down the passage. It strikes the back wall. Someone, 4,000 years ago, or 3,000 or 2,000, stood where you would stand if you were there now, and watched that light, and knew what it meant, and felt whatever the human heart feels when the year turns and the sun begins to return. We do not know their name. We do not know their language. We do not know the full contours of their world, but we know they stood there. The chamber proves it. The alignment proves it. The stones prove it. And that is something. In the great darkness of the pre-Columbian past, in the vast silence of the centuries before writing reached this continent, the stones speak, quietly, in the language of orientation and dimension and construction, but they speak. The question is whether we are willing to listen. The night is long, and the forest is quiet, and the stones are patient. They have been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. Now I want to tell you about something that has been sitting at the edge of this story. Something I have been saving because it requires a particular kind of patience to understand, a particular willingness to hold complexity without resolving it too quickly. There is a tradition among some researchers who study ancient American mysteries of looking at what is called the linguistic evidence, the comparative study of languages spoken by ancient peoples on both sides of the Atlantic, to find traces of contact in the structure and vocabulary of the languages themselves. This is genuinely difficult territory. Linguistics is a rigorous science, and the comparative method used to identify language relationships is well established and demanding. You cannot simply find words that sound alike in two languages and conclude that the languages are related. Sound-alike words appear between unrelated languages constantly, the result of the limited phonetic inventory available to human speech and the law of large numbers. True linguistic relationship requires systematic correspondences in phonology and grammar and vocabulary that follow the predictable patterns of sound change across time. Barry Fell claimed to find linguistic relationships between Celtic and some Native American languages. His claim was dismissed, with some justification, by professional linguists who found his comparative methodology unconvincing. But Fell is not the only researcher who has looked at this question. There have been more recent, more rigorous attempts to compare certain features of Eastern Algonquian languages, the language family that includes Abenaki and Micmac and Lenape and others, with certain features of ancient Atlantic European languages. The results of these comparisons are, at minimum, suggestive. There are structural features of some Algonquian languages that are unusual within the Native American linguistic landscape and that have analogues in ancient Celtic languages. There are sound correspondences that, while not conclusive on their own, are consistent with very distant relationship or with significant language contact at some point in the past. This is specialist territory, and I want to be honest about the limits of what I can tell you with confidence. The linguistic evidence is contested and incomplete. Professional linguists who specialize in Native American languages have largely not engaged with these comparisons, either dismissing them without detailed analysis or simply not responding. The researchers doing the comparisons are, again, working at the edge of their discipline and with limited institutional support. But the linguistic question is worth asking. Languages are extraordinarily sensitive records of contact. When two peoples meet and interact, their languages show it, in loanwords and grammatical borrowings and phonological changes. If Bronze Age people from the Atlantic Celtic world spent time in New England, even for a few centuries, the languages of the people they met would likely carry some trace of that contact. Finding that trace, if it is there, would require a level of interdisciplinary cooperation, bringing professional linguists together with archaeologists and geneticists and historians in a focused investigation of the question that has not yet happened. It is another item on the list of investigations that deserve to happen but have not. Let me take you to one more place before this story reaches its natural resting point. One more site, one more piece of evidence, one more stone in the mosaic. There is a site in the hills of western Massachusetts that local historians have known about for generations. It is not famous. It does not appear in any official archaeological survey. It has never been the subject of professional excavation. It sits on private land, and the family that owns the land has, for the past several decades, quietly allowed researchers who they trusted to come and look, without publicity, without interference. The site consists of a cluster of stone structures on a hillside, 3 chambers of varying size, a series of standing stones, and a flat outcropping of bedrock that shows what appear to be incised marks. The chambers are well built, dry laid, corbelled, oriented toward the northeast. The standing stones are arranged in a pattern that, when surveyed, reveals multiple astronomical alignments. What makes this site different, what makes it the thing I have saved until late in this story, is what sits at the center of the standing stone arrangement. At the center of the arrangement, directly on the flat bedrock, there is a carved basin. Not a large basin, perhaps 18 inches in diameter and 4 inches deep. It has been cut into the bedrock by something harder than the bedrock. A tool, a patient tool, repeatedly applied. The basin is circular. Its sides are smooth. Its floor is flat. And on the interior of the basin, at the bottom, there is a carved symbol, a circle with a cross inside it, the ancient solar symbol that appears in rock art from the Iberian Peninsula to to Ireland to Scandinavia, the symbol that in various ancient cultures represents the sun, the wheel, the cycle of the year. The solar circle is one of the oldest symbols in the human artistic record. It appears in Paleolithic cave art in Europe. It is one of the earliest symbols used by proto-writing systems in the ancient Middle East. It is carved on the stones of megalithic monuments across Atlantic Europe. It is also found in rock art across North America, including in the southwest and in the eastern woodlands. Its presence in a carved basin at the center of a standing stone arrangement that is astronomically aligned at a site that has never been officially excavated or documented by mainstream archaeology is either another piece of the pattern or an extraordinary coincidence. I have been sitting with this image for several years now. The basin, cut into the Massachusetts bedrock, the solar circle at the bottom, the standing stones around it catching the light at the turning of the year. I cannot tell you with certainty what it is. I can tell you that it is there, that people who have seen it and photographed it and surveyed the site around it find it remarkable and find the conventional dismissals inadequate. I can tell you that it deserves to be excavated, documented, dated, and studied by people with the full range of relevant expertise. I can tell you that it has not been, and that this is a failure, a genuine failure of the institution of American archaeology to do what it exists to do. And I can tell you that the stones, the basin, the symbol at its center, the chambers on the hillside, the standing stones catching the light, will be there when someone finally decides to take them seriously. They are patient. They have been patient for a very long time. There is a way of thinking about history that treats it as a completed thing, a record of events that happened and were observed and written down and can now be known. In this view, the unknown parts of history are simply gaps, and the gaps will be filled in eventually. But the framework that organizes the known parts is basically correct, basically stable, basically trustworthy. And then there is another way of thinking about history that treats it as a partially recovered record of events, most of which were not observed or written down, most of which left fragmentary traces in the physical world that we are still learning to read. In this view, the gaps are not just gaps, they are evidence of something. They are the shape of what we have not yet found, and what we have not yet found may change the framework. Not because the framework is worthless, but because it was built from incomplete evidence and the new evidence may not fit. The story of pre-Columbian North America is in the second category. The framework, the Clovis first model and its descendant theories, is built from real evidence and represents genuine knowledge, but it is also built from incomplete evidence, and the evidence we have been looking at tonight suggests strongly that it is incomplete in ways that matter. The stones of New England matter, the inscriptions matter, the genetics matter, the astronomical alignments matter. Not because they prove a specific narrative of ancient contact, but because they constitute evidence that the current narrative is missing something, that there is more to the story than the story currently tells. Finding out what is missing requires investigation. It requires the kind of open-minded, rigorous, multidisciplinary investigation that good science requires. It requires setting aside the institutional inertia that has kept these questions at the margins of American archaeology for the past century. It requires being honest about the difference between what we know and what we assume, between what the evidence says and what the model requires. The stones are offering us that invitation. The question is whether we will accept it. When I think about the people who built these chambers, whoever they were, I am struck by what they chose to mark and to celebrate. They did not build temples to kings or monuments to military victories or administrative centers for the management of an empire. They built chambers that caught the solstice light. They aligned standing stones to the cross-quarter days. They marked the turning of the year, the moment when the darkness is longest and the sun begins to return. They were celebrating survival, the continuation of life, the promise of the spring. That celebration transcends culture and transcends time. It is the celebration of the Wampanoag people who held ceremonies at the winter solstice. It is the celebration of the Celtic peoples whose festivals of Samhain and Imbolc marked the same seasonal turning points. It is the celebration that, in transformed and attenuated form, we carry forward in our own holidays, Christmas and Hanukkah and the New Year, all clustered at the darkest time of the year, all expressing the same ancient human relief that the light is coming back. Whatever the specific cultural tradition of the chamber builders, they were doing something that is recognizably human. They were paying attention to the sky. They were marking what mattered. They were building something to last, and it has lasted. That is the final remarkable thing about the New England stone chambers. They have lasted. Through centuries of colonial agriculture and development, and the general indifference of a civilization that did not know what to make of them, they have lasted. The stones are still fitted. The corbelled ceilings still hold. The entrances still face the right direction. The chambers still catch the solstice light. Whatever the builders intended, whatever ceremony or purpose or knowledge those chambers were built to serve, they built for the ages, and the ages have kept them. The forest has grown around them. The hillsides have changed. The world that built them is entirely gone, remembered in no document, known to no one with certainty. And yet the chambers remain patient and precise and aligned to the sun, waiting for the moment when someone will finally ask the right questions and refuse to accept the easy answers. I hope that moment is coming. I think it is. The evidence is accumulating, slowly, at the edges of the institution, in the work of researchers who have spent their careers outside the mainstream, because the mainstream had no room for what they were finding, in the genetic databases that are revealing a more complex picture of ancient American populations with every passing year, in the astronomical surveys that document alignments too precise to be coincidental, in the ground-penetrating radar surveys that find structures beneath the structures that are already there. The evidence is accumulating, and eventually it will accumulate to a point where the institution cannot continue to ignore it without making a spectacle of its own rigidity. That is how paradigms change. Not easily, not quickly, not without resistance, but inexorably. The stones of New England have been part of this landscape for a very long time. They will be part of it for longer, still. And someday, perhaps in our lifetimes, perhaps in the lifetimes of the people who come after us, someone will stand in one of those chambers on a winter solstice morning, watching the light travel down the passage and strike the back wall in its brief rectangle of gold, and they will know, not wonder, not suspect, but know who put that stone in that hillside and why. Until then, the chambers wait. The stones are patient. The light returns each year to the precise spot it has been returning to for thousands of years. And the story is not finished. It has barely begun. You've been listening to a long journey through the evidence and the mysteries and the silences of American prehistory. If you made it to this point, lying in the dark somewhere on this planet, your breath slowing, the sounds of your world fading into the background, then you have been a companion on this journey, and I am grateful for that. The questions we have been asking tonight are not small questions. They are questions about who we are, where we came from, how connected the ancient human world was, how much we do not know, how much we may never know. They are questions that the stones themselves raise, sitting on their hillsides in the Vermont forests, aligned to the winter sky. I think about those stones often. I think about what it would have been like to be there when they were being built. To carry those granite slabs, to fit them into place, to calculate the angle of the entrance passage so that the solstice light would enter correctly, to stand back when it was done and know that you had made something that would last. It lasted. The light still comes, and somewhere, under the accumulated soil of centuries, under the trees and the leaves and the quiet of the New England winter, the rest of the story is still there, waiting to be found. You can drift towards sleep with that thought. The rest of the story is still there, waiting, patient as stone. If this journey helped carry you into the night, if these questions found a comfortable home in the space between waking and sleeping, you might consider subscribing so these late-night explorations can continue. Leave a comment if you feel moved to. Tell me where in the world you are listening from, what time it is where you are, what the night looks like outside your window. Those small connections across geography and time zones feel meaningful to me in a way that is hard to explain but very real. The stars that watched over the builders of those stone chambers are the same stars above you tonight, shifted slightly by the slow wobble of the Earth's axis over the millennia, but recognizably the same. The Pleiades and Orion and the long cold band of the Milky Way. They have been watching this story unfold for a very long time. They will watch it continue. Rest now. The questions will be there in the morning, patient and interesting, and worth returning to. The stones will still be on their hillsides. The solstice will still come around. And the light will still enter the chamber, year after year, faithful as it has always been, marking the turning that ancient hands aligned it to mark, speaking in the only language that has lasted through every change and every loss and every silence, the language of stone and light and time. Good night. There is something I did not tell you earlier in this story, something I have been thinking about how to approach, because it sits at the intersection of the scientific and the experiential in a way that is difficult to navigate without sounding either credulous or dismissive. People who spend time at the New England stone chamber sites report experiences that they find difficult to explain. Not supernatural experiences, not visions or voices, or the dramatic apparitions of ghost story tradition. Something quieter and harder to name, a quality of attention that the sites seem to demand, a sense of being in a place that is organized around a principle that your body understands, even when your mind does not. A geologist who spent 3 seasons surveying the sites wrote in her field notes, which she shared with a colleague who shared them with me, that she had spent 20 years doing fieldwork in some of the most dramatic geological settings on the planet, the Grand Canyon walls and the volcanic coast of Iceland and the glacier-carved fjords of Norway, and that none of those places had produced in her what the New England chamber sites produced, a sustained, quiet conviction that the place was made, that every stone was placed, that nothing in the arrangement was accidental. She was writing as a scientist. She was noting a perceptual experience that she could not fully explain in purely physical terms. The chambers produced in her a response that was appropriate to designed spaces, to spaces that had been organized by intention and knowledge and purpose, rather than to natural formations. This is worth taking seriously, not as evidence of the supernatural, but as evidence about the chambers themselves. Designed spaces produce a different response in human perception than natural formations. We are very good at detecting design, at recognizing the difference between the random and the organized. When someone who has spent decades in natural landscapes says that a particular site feels designed, that perception should be taken seriously as data about the site. The chambers feel designed because they are designed. Their alignments are intentional. Their proportions are calculated. Their construction requires knowledge and planning that cannot be attributed to accident or to the casual labor of a colonial farmer clearing a field. The experiential testimony of people who visit these sites is consistent across backgrounds and expectations and prior knowledge. The chambers do something to human attention. They organize it. They focus it. They create a quality of presence that is different from what you feel in the surrounding forest or in an unstructured rock outcropping. That is what design does. That is what it is for. Whatever the full story of these chambers turns out to be, whatever the genetic analysis and the linguistic comparisons and the archaeological excavations eventually reveal, the chambers themselves are already telling us something simply by being what they are. They are telling us that someone, somewhere, in a time we cannot precisely name, thought carefully about this hillside and this orientation and this construction method and this purpose, and built something to embody what they thought about. That act of careful thought, embodied in stone, is available to us today. We can stand in that thought. We can let the solstice light enter it. We can feel the precision of it, the intention of it, the human presence in it. That is remarkable. That is worth celebrating, regardless of what the genealogical and cultural details ultimately turn out to be. Now, let me tell you about the coastline, because one of the things that gets lost in the debate about the stone chambers and the inscriptions and the possible Bronze Age contact is the geography. The geography of the North Atlantic in the Bronze Age was different from what it is today in ways that are significant to the question of contact. I mentioned earlier that sea levels at the end of the last ice age were roughly 400 feet lower than today. This is important because it means that the coastline of New England, the coastline that any Atlantic voyager would have been approaching, looked very different. The continental shelf, which today slopes gently from the coast to deep water, beginning perhaps 100 miles offshore, was in the early Bronze Age largely above water. The beaches and harbours that would have welcomed arriving voyagers were not where today's coastlines are, but were far out on what is now the continental shelf. What this means practically is that the archaeological evidence of any initial contact, any harbouring of boats and establishing of camps on the exposed continental shelf, is now underwater. The first traces of Bronze Age European presence in North America, if they exist, are inaccessible with current technology. What has survived, what we can access, are the things that were built or done in the interior, on the hills and in the valleys above the old coastline. The stone chambers are on high ground. They are on hillsides and hilltops. They are in positions that would have been visible from the now submerged coastline, positions that would have served as landmarks for people approaching by sea. When you look at the distribution of New England stone chamber sites on a map, with this in mind, something interesting emerges. The sites cluster along river valleys and in upland positions that would have been logical stopping points for people moving inland from the coast. They are spaced in ways that suggest a network a series of known locations connected by routes that a knowledgeable traveler could follow. This is speculative interpretation of the distribution data. The same distribution could have other explanations. But it is consistent with what you would expect if the chambers were built by people who arrived by sea and established a series of inland sites for purposes we can only guess at. Trade, ceremony, seasonal habitation, some combination of all of these. The geography fits the hypothesis. And when the geography fits, it strengthens the hypothesis. Not conclusively, but meaningfully. There is another geographical observation that I want to make, one that is rarely discussed in the literature on the New England chambers, but that seems to me important. The latitude of New England, between roughly 41 and 45 degrees north, is almost exactly the same latitude as the core regions of Atlantic megalithic Europe. Britain lies between roughly 50 and 58 degrees north, Brittany around 47 to 48 degrees, Iberia from roughly 36 to 44 degrees. The overlap is significant for a specific reason. The astronomical phenomena that the chamber builders were aligning their monuments to are latitude dependent. The angle of the sunrise and sunset at the solstices, the positions on the horizon where the sun rises and sets on the longest and shortest days vary with latitude. At 51 degrees north, the latitude of Stonehenge, the summer solstice sunrise occurs at a different compass bearing than it does at 43 degrees north, the latitude of central Vermont. If you built a monument in Brittany aligned to the summer solstice sunrise, and then you transported that monument design to New England, the alignment would not work. You would have to recalculate the orientation for the new latitude. The New England chambers are correctly oriented for their actual latitudes. They are not copies of European monuments. They are correctly aligned monuments built at a different latitude, which means the people who built them knew how to adapt their astronomical knowledge to a new location. They understood the latitude dependence of the solar alignments. They either knew the latitude of New England, or they observed the horizon carefully over multiple years before building, and let their observations guide the orientation. Either of those possibilities implies a level of astronomical sophistication that is not consistent with the simple picture of Bronze Age people who stumbled onto this continent by accident and built a few stone structures before sailing home. It implies people who came with knowledge, who came with intention, who knew what they were doing, and had the technical capacity to do it correctly in a new environment. That is not a conclusion to take lightly, but it is a conclusion that the orientation data, properly analysed, seems to support. Let me sit with you in the silence of this for a moment, because there is a lot to hold here. The alignments, the construction techniques, the inscriptions, the genetics, the geography, the oral traditions, the colonial descriptions, all of these pieces of evidence, examined individually and in combination, paint a picture that is, at minimum, deeply anomalous within the framework of the accepted model. The accepted model says, pre-Columbian North America was isolated from the Old World. No significant contact occurred. The stone chambers are root cellars or Native American structures of uncertain purpose. The inscriptions are natural marks or wishful misreadings. The genetic anomalies are the result of drift. The astronomical alignments are coincidences. The evidence says the chambers are astronomically aligned in ways that are not accidental and that share structural characteristics with European megalithic monuments. The inscriptions, at some sites, show structural properties inconsistent with random mark-making. The genetic data includes anomalies that are difficult to explain without some form of contact. The maritime technology of Bronze Age Atlantic Europe was sufficient to make the crossing. The geography of the North Atlantic provides a navigable route. These are two different stories. One of them fits the existing model. One of them fits the evidence. This does not mean the existing model is worthless. It means the existing model is incomplete. And the direction in which it is incomplete is the direction of the evidence, toward more contact, more complexity, more connection between the ancient American and the ancient Old World. I am not in a position to tell you what happened. I am not in a position to give you a definitive answer about who built the New England stone chambers or when or why. The evidence does not yet support definitive answers. What it supports is a serious investigation that has not yet taken place. But I want you to feel, as you lie in the dark listening to this, the weight and the wonder of the question, because the question is genuinely wonderful. It is asking whether the human story of this continent is connected to the wider human story of the Atlantic world in ways we have not yet recognized. It is asking whether the people who built Newgrange in Ireland and Carnac in Brittany and the Chambers of Orkney were part of a wider world that extended, at some point, to the hillsides of Vermont and New Hampshire? If the answer is yes, then the human story is bigger than we thought. More connected, more mobile, more adventurous. The oceans were crossed before we said they were crossed. The Americas were part of the wider world before Columbus made them officially part of it. If the answer is no, then we have a collection of genuinely extraordinary coincidences to explain, and the explanation will be interesting in its own right. Either way, the investigation is worth doing. Let us go now to a specific kind of evidence that I have not yet discussed. Evidence that lives not in stones or genes or inscriptions, but in plants. Plants are remarkable recorders of human movement. They travel with us. They are carried in cargo and in clothing and in the soil on boots and in the digestive tracts of animals. When humans move, plants move with them, sometimes accidentally and sometimes intentionally. The distribution of cultivated and useful plants around the world is, in many cases, a map of human migration and contact. The distribution of certain plants in pre-Columbian North America has been the subject of ongoing debate among botanists and archaeologists for decades. Several plants that appear in the archaeological and historical record of North America before European contact have origins in or connections to the Old World that are difficult to explain without some form of pre-Columbian contact. The most discussed of these is the coconut, which is found in archaeological contexts on the coasts of the Americas before European contact, and whose distribution pattern suggests human transport rather than natural drift alone. But there are others, less famous and perhaps more telling. There are a handful of plant species that appear in both Atlantic European archaeological contexts and in pre-Columbian northeastern North American contexts that have nutritional or medicinal properties that would have made them valuable trade items, and that do not have obvious mechanisms for natural dispersal across the Atlantic. I am being deliberately vague about specific species here, because the botanical evidence in this area is genuinely contested, and I do not want to overstate the confidence level of the claims. What I can say is that there are botanical researchers who have looked at this question carefully and who believe the plant distribution data is consistent with, though not proof of, transatlantic contact in the Bronze Age period. What makes the botanical evidence interesting is its independence from the other lines of evidence. The stones and the genetics and the inscriptions are all potentially vulnerable to the objection that they have been interpreted through a lens of prior expectation, that people who believe in pre-Columbian contact tend to see the evidence they are looking for. This is a fair methodological concern, even if it does not fully account for all the evidence. But botanists studying plant distribution patterns typically do not have a prior commitment to any particular model of pre-Columbian contact. They are looking at distribution data and asking the simplest question: how did this plant get here? When the simplest answer to that question is human transport, the implication is contact. The botanical evidence is thin. I want to be honest about that. It is suggestive rather than conclusive, but it is another line of evidence, another data point, in a picture that has many data points and a consistent pattern. Now let me tell you about a researcher who approached this whole question from a direction that nobody else had thought to try. His name is not important, and he is still active and would prefer not to be identified, but the approach he took is worth describing. He was trained as a geologist, and he brought to the question of the New England chambers the methodological habits of his discipline, specifically the use of weathering analysis to estimate the age of exposed rock surfaces. Rock weathers. It weathers at rates that are affected by climate and mineralogy and exposure conditions, but that are, for a given rock type in a given climate, reasonably consistent. If you know the weathering rate of a particular kind of stone in a particular environment, you can estimate, from the degree of weathering on a rock surface, how long that surface has been exposed. This is not a new technique. It is used in geology routinely to estimate the age of landslides, glacial deposits, and other geological features. It is not archaeology, and its application to archaeological contexts is methodologically complex, requiring careful control for the many variables that affect weathering rates. But it is a real technique with real evidentiary value when applied carefully. This geologist spent several years taking samples from the interior surfaces of New England chambers and from the exterior surfaces of standing stones associated with those chambers, and analyzing them for weathering characteristics, comparing the results with known weathering rates for the same rock types in the same regional climate. His conclusions, shared in a limited way with the research community, but never formally published because he did not want to expose himself to the professional costs of association with this field, were that several of the sites he studied showed weathering characteristics consistent with ages of 2,000 to 4,000 years. The range was wide because of the inherent uncertainty in the method and the variability in exposure conditions, but the lower end of the range was well beyond the colonial period, and the upper end was in the Bronze Age. He was careful in describing his conclusions. He said the weathering data was consistent with the hypothesis that the chambers were built 2,000 to 4,000 years ago. He did not say the weathering data proved this. He said it was not inconsistent with it. That kind of careful, qualified statement is exactly what rigorous science looks like. The conclusion is appropriately hedged. The method is acknowledged to have limitations. The evidence is presented as consistent with a hypothesis rather than as proof of it. And because the hypothesis is the pre-Columbian construction of the chambers, the careful and qualified evidence has received the same reception as the less careful and less qualified evidence. No response. The pattern holds. Let me now tell you about the oldest documented record of one of these sites. In the journals of a Massachusetts Bay Colony official from the 1640s, there is a brief but interesting entry describing a visit to a hill near the town of Salem, New Hampshire, where, the official notes, there are curious stone structures of great age that the local natives say were built by a people who came before them. The entry is brief, and the official clearly does not know what to make of what he saw. He describes the structures as resembling in some respects the ancient monuments of the old country, by which he presumably means the stone chambers and standing stones of Britain, which were known to educated Englishmen of his era as ancient features of their landscape. This comparison, made in the 1640s by a man who had no reason to fabricate it, and every reason to dismiss the structures as native curiosities if that was the obvious explanation, is interesting for several reasons. First, it establishes that the sites were already of apparent great age in the 17th century, old enough that the colonial official noted this explicitly. Second, it confirms that local Native Americans were already attributing the structures to a pre-existing people. Third, and perhaps most significantly, it records the impression of a 17th century Englishman with direct knowledge of the stone monuments of Britain that these New England structures were similar to those monuments. This is not scientific evidence. It is a historical document, a personal observation made by one person about his subjective experience of a site. But it is contemporaneous documentation, made within 2 decades of European settlement of the area, and it describes a state of affairs that is consistent with the hypothesis. Old structures, locally attributed to a people who came before, appearing to a knowledgeable European observer to resemble the ancient stone monuments of Atlantic Europe. The document is in a historical archive. It has been seen by researchers interested in the New England chambers. It has not been cited in mainstream archaeological literature, because mainstream archaeological literature on the New England chambers is essentially non-existent. There are more such documents. The historical record of colonial New England is quite extensive, and it contains a number of such references, brief, incidental, not the focus of the document in which they appear, but noting the presence of stone structures that the settlers found curious and old, and not clearly attributable to the Native American populations they knew. These references have been collected by NERA researchers and published in the organization's journal. They have not been collected or analyzed by mainstream archaeologists. The documents do not prove anything by themselves, but they establish, as a historical fact, that the stone chambers were already a recognized feature of the New England landscape in the earliest period of European settlement, that they were regarded as ancient by the Native Americans who knew them, and that they were noted as unusual and reminiscent of Old World monuments by European settlers who had no agenda beyond describing what they observed. That historical baseline is worth having. It anchors the question in documented fact rather than speculation. I want to shift now to talking about what is actually happening in the current research landscape, because the story is not static. Things are changing, slowly, and in ways that are both encouraging and frustrating in different measures. The last decade has seen a significant expansion of the genetic evidence relevant to pre-Columbian contact. The revolution in ancient DNA extraction and analysis has made it possible to read the genetic histories of ancient populations with a precision that was inconceivable 20 years ago. Researchers have sequenced the genomes of ancient humans from across the Americas and from across Europe and Asia and Africa, and the picture of ancient human movement that is emerging from this work is dramatically more complex than the simple story the Clovis First model requires. Ancient DNA research has confirmed that the Americas were colonized from Northeast Asia. It has confirmed that there were multiple waves of migration, not a single founding population. It has revealed that the ancient populations of the Americas were more diverse than their modern descendants, a sign of population processes that included extinction and replacement and mixing over long periods of time. It has also revealed anomalies, genetic signals in ancient South American populations that point toward Australasia, not Asia. Evidence of population movements within the Americas that were more dynamic and long-range than anyone expected. And, in the ancient DNA of northeastern North American populations, the persistent signal of haplogroup X, 2A, the mitochondrial lineage whose closest relatives outside the Americas are found in the populations of the Middle East and Europe. The ancient DNA research has not proven pre-Columbian Atlantic contact, but it has consistently revealed that the ancient Americas were more complex, more connected, and more surprising than the previous model required. And each time the ancient DNA reveals something unexpected, the evidence for a more complex picture accumulates, and the threshold for taking the hypothesis of Atlantic contact seriously drops a little lower. The archaeoastronomy research is also accumulating. More sites are being surveyed with professional equipment. More alignments are being documented. The statistical database of New England chamber orientations is growing, and the growing database is making it harder to dismiss the alignments as coincidences. A researcher who surveys 60 sites and finds statistically significant astronomical alignments at 50 of them is not describing a coincidence. She is describing a pattern, and patterns require explanation. The ground-penetrating radar surveys are revealing hidden complexity at sites that appeared simple on the surface. The subsurface features identified at the Salem site and elsewhere have not been excavated, but their existence is documented, and the documentation is available to anyone who wants to look at it. And the historical archival research continues, quietly, in the historical societies and town archives and library collections of New England, finding more incidental references to the stone chambers in the earliest colonial records, building a documentary history that places the sites firmly in the colonial landscape while noting their perceived antiquity. All of this research is happening. It is happening outside the mainstream, in organizations like NERA, and in the work of individual researchers who have found ways to continue without institutional support. But it is happening, and it is building a body of evidence that is more comprehensive and more rigorous than what was available a generation ago. The mainstream has not responded. The mainstream journals have not published the research. The mainstream conferences have not included it in their programs. The mainstream archaeologists have not written the refutations that would at least acknowledge the evidence by engaging with it. The silence continues. But the evidence does not care about the silence. It accumulates. And eventually, paradigms change. There is a researcher in her 30s, recently finished with a doctorate in archaeoastronomy from a European institution, who has begun, quietly and carefully, to include the New England chamber sites in her comparative work on Bronze Age astronomical monuments in the Atlantic world. She is being careful. She is framing the New England sites as anomalies that require explanation rather than as evidence of any specific theory. She is building a case, stone by stone in the academic sense, that is designed to survive the kind of scrutiny that will come when she eventually publishes. She knows that the scrutiny will be intense. She knows that the institutional resistance to her conclusions will be proportional to how threatening those conclusions are to the existing model. She is preparing for that resistance by making her evidence as rigorous as possible and her claims as carefully bounded as possible. She told me, in a conversation I want to share with you, that the thing that keeps her going is not any particular theory about who built the chambers or when. It is the chambers themselves. She said that every time she stands in one of them, on any day, at any time of year, she feels the same thing, that these places were made with intention and knowledge, and that the intention and knowledge deserve to be understood. That not understanding them is a failure of scholarship that she takes personally. I find that a very human and very admirable statement. It is the statement of a scientist who is motivated by genuine curiosity rather than by the desire to confirm a prior belief. She does not know what the chambers are. She wants to find out. She is doing the work that might eventually allow her to find out. That work is what science is supposed to be. I hope she finishes it. I hope she publishes it. I hope the institutions that have maintained the silence respond with engagement rather than dismissal. I hope that the generation of archaeologists who come after the current generation find a field that is more open to the full range of evidence and more willing to follow that evidence wherever it leads. I think that is happening, Slowly, with the usual friction of institutional change but happening. The stones will be there when it happens. They will not have moved. Let me tell you one more story before I bring this to a close. One more piece of this mosaic that sits in the corner and catches the light in a way that I keep coming back to. In the town of Mystery Hill, which is the tourist name for the Salem, New Hampshire site that houses what is called America's Stonehenge, there is a particular chamber that has been studied more carefully than almost any other at the site. It is not the largest chamber. It is not the most dramatically aligned. It is a medium-sized space with a corbelled ceiling and an entrance passage oriented to the southwest. What makes this chamber interesting is what is at the back of it. At the back wall of the chamber, set into the construction at a height of about 4 feet from the floor, is a single stone that is different from the others. It is not different in material. It is the same local granite as the rest of the construction, but it is different in surface treatment. Its interior face, the face that would be seen by someone standing in the chamber, is smooth. Not roughly smooth in the way that stone becomes smooth when it weathers, but precisely smooth, deliberately ground to a flat surface. And on that smooth surface, in light that is low and raking, there are marks. Not clearly legible characters, not obviously natural marks, but something in between. Marks with a regularity and a directionality and a depth consistency that suggests they were made deliberately, with a tool, following some kind of plan. The marks have been photographed many times over the years. The photographs vary in their ability to reveal the marks, depending on the lighting conditions, and this variation has led to disagreements about whether the marks are really there or are artifacts of photographic technique. High-resolution photogrammetry, which eliminates the dependency on lighting angle, has been used at the site, and the results confirm that there are physical impressions in the stone surface, regular and directed, that are not natural weathering or fracture patterns. What the marks say, if they say anything, is unknown. They have not been successfully interpreted by anyone with relevant expertise, partly because the relevant expertise, the ability to identify ancient Atlantic scripts, is vanishingly rare, and the small number of people who have it have not spent significant time with the chamber. The marks remain documented and undeciphered, but the smooth back wall of the chamber, with its undeciphered marks, sits in my mind as a kind of summary of the whole situation. Something was put there deliberately. Something was intended. Something was communicated, or commemorated, or consecrated on that surface, and we cannot read it. Not because the information is not there. It is. The marks are there, physical, real, preserved in the stone, but the code, the cultural knowledge that would allow us to understand them, is gone. It went with the people who made them, whenever and wherever that was. This is the nature of lost histories. They do not disappear entirely. They leave traces. But the traces require interpretation, and interpretation requires knowledge, and the knowledge is sometimes irretrievably lost. Sometimes it is only mostly lost. Sometimes there is enough still accessible in the archives and the ethnographies and the comparative studies and the scientific analyses to piece together a partial understanding. The work of piecing together that partial understanding is what the researchers I have been describing are doing. It is slow and difficult and professionally costly and institutionally opposed, but it is the work that the evidence demands, and some people are doing it. I want to honor that work. I want to say that the researchers who have spent decades studying these sites, who have documented and measured and analyzed and published and been ignored, have been doing something important. They have been maintaining the possibility of understanding, keeping alive the thread of inquiry that might eventually lead to answers. The answers are not here yet, but the possibility of them is preserved in the archives and the papers and the field notes and the collections, waiting for the moment when the institutional resistance to the question finally exhausts itself and someone with the full resources of mainstream archaeology brings those resources to bear on what is actually there. Until that moment, the chambers wait as they have always waited. The light enters them at the right time. The stones hold their alignments. The marks on the back wall of the chamber at America's Stonehenge continue to say whatever they say, in a language that we have not yet recovered. The night is long, the forest is quiet, the stones are patient, and the story, the full and real and complex story of human presence on this continent before the age of recorded history, before Columbus, before the Norse, before any of the contacts we currently acknowledge, that story is still out there, embedded in the landscape, encoded in genes and stones and the orientation of chambers on hillsides that face the sunrise on the longest day. We have not found it yet. Not completely. Not in a form that the institutions will accept. But we are getting closer. And the stones are waiting for us to arrive. You know, there is something I find deeply moving about this story when I step back and look at it whole. We are a species that builds. We build things with our hands. Things that outlast us. Things that carry something of us forward into times we will not live to see. The stone chambers of New England are the most durable evidence we have of whatever people built them. Everything else about those people, their language, their beliefs, their social structures, their songs and stories and relationships and laughter and grief, all of that is gone, completely gone. What is left is the way they place stone on stone. And the way they place stone on stone is so deliberate, so informed, so precisely calibrated to the movements of the sun, that it tells us something important about who they were. They were people who paid attention. They were people who cared about the sky and about time and about the turning of the year. They were people who thought about permanence, who built for the long view, who understood that the solstice will happen next year and the year after that, and the year after that, and who wanted their buildings to be there for all of those solstices. They got what they wanted. The buildings are there. Whether they were Bronze Age sailors from Atlantic Europe or an unknown pre-contact North American culture or something else entirely. They were people who built for the ages, and the ages have kept their buildings. That is an act of connection across time. Whoever built these chambers was reaching forward, through the dark of all the centuries they could not see, and offering something to the people who came after them. An alignment, a structure, a place where the light would come at the turning of the year. We are the people who came after them. The light is still coming. All we have to do is be there to receive it, and to ask, honestly and carefully, who lit the way. There are nights when I think about the builders of the New England chambers the way I think about certain composers or writers whose names are forgotten but whose work survives. The music is still there, or the story, or in this case the stone alignment, and the person who made it is utterly gone, leaving only the made thing, the intention crystallized into matter. There is a humility and a dignity in that situation. You cannot know if anyone will understand what you have made. You cannot know if anyone will even recognize it as made rather than natural. You build anyway. You align the entrance to the sunrise anyway. You fit the stones with the care they deserve anyway. Because the act of making it, of caring enough to do it right, is itself the thing. The understanding of it by future people, that is a gift you cannot count on. You make it and you release it. The builders of these chambers made something and released it. Whatever their intentions, whatever the ceremonies they conducted, and the knowledge they embedded in the orientations and proportions of what they built, they released all of that into the future, into us. And we are standing at the edge of understanding what they made. Not all the way there, but closer than we were a generation ago. That feels like something. The history of discovery is full of moments when something very old and very important finally got the attention it deserved. When the right person with the right tools and the right open mind stood in front of something that had been overlooked or dismissed, and saw it clearly for what it was. That moment, for the New England stone chambers, has not yet come, but it will. These stones are not going anywhere. They are more patient than the institution that ignores them. They are more patient than the careers that are built on the existing model. They are more patient than the political and legal frameworks that have made this kind of investigation difficult. They are as patient as stone, which is to say, enormously, cosmically patient. They will wait for the archaeologist who comes with the right tools and the right questions and the right absence of prior assumptions and stands in one of these chambers on a solstice morning and watches the light and says, clearly and in print and in a peer-reviewed journal with enough professional courage to back the claim, this was made. I can prove it was made. And when I prove it was made, I will follow that proof wherever it leads. That person is out there somewhere. Maybe she is the young researcher I told you about. Maybe she is someone who has not yet finished her education, someone who will be shaped by a field that is slowly, grudgingly opening to the possibility that the story is more complex than it appeared. I hope she comes soon. The chambers are ready for her. The light is ready. The stones are patient. And the story of who built them, and when, and from where, and why, is one of the most interesting and most important unanswered questions in American history. Not just American history, human history. Because if the story of these chambers is the story of Bronze Age people crossing the North Atlantic to a continent they could not have known existed, to build monuments aligned to the solstice on hills above a coastline that is now underwater, to leave inscriptions in scripts we are still learning to read, and then to vanish from the historical record, leaving only the stones and the alignments and the ghost of their knowledge in the distribution of a mitochondrial haplogroup in the tribes of the Northeast, then that story is one of the most extraordinary stories in the human record. A story of daring and skill and curiosity and distance and time. A story of people who looked at an ocean and decided to cross it. A story of the human refusal to accept the horizon as a limit. That story deserves to be told fully and honestly, and I believe it will be. Until it is, the stones speak in the only language available to them, the language of alignment and dimension and the angle of the midwinter sun entering the passage and striking the back wall in its brief and faithful rectangle of gold. That language has been waiting 4,000 years to be translated. It is still waiting, but not, I think, for much longer. Sleep well tonight. Dream of cold hillsides in Vermont and the smell of old stone and the way the light looks when it first comes over the hill on the shortest day of the year and enters the chamber that someone built to receive it. Dream of the builders who made that chamber, who chose that hill, who measured that angle, who fitted those stones with a precision that centuries of frost and rain and snow have not disturbed. They were human, like you. They looked at the sky the way you look at the sky. They wondered about the things we wonder about. They wanted to mark what mattered and build something to last. They succeeded. The chambers are still there. The light still comes. And somewhere in the hills of New England, in a forest that has grown up around stones that were old when the forest was young, the solstice morning is waiting, faithful as it has always been, ready to do what it has done every year. For as long as the sun has risen over those hills, it will rise, and the light will enter the chamber, and the chamber will hold it for those 20 minutes of gold. And nobody alive knows who built it that way. But someone is going to find out. That is enough to carry you into sleep. Good night. But since you are still here, since sleep has not yet taken you, let me keep talking. Let me take you deeper into this story, into some of its stranger corners and its more specific details, because the details matter. The details are where truth lives. There is a town in Connecticut called Groton, best known today for its submarine base and its shipbuilding history. Groton sits at the mouth of the Thames River where it opens into Long Island Sound, a sheltered and navigable stretch of water that would have been one of the most attractive harbours on the North Atlantic coast for any people arriving by sea. In the hills above Groton, in stretches of forest that have been slowly eaten by suburban development over the past several decades, there are, or were, a series of stone structures that local historians have been documenting for more than a century. Some of these structures have been destroyed by development. Some have been absorbed into the landscape of colonial-era stone walls and agricultural clearings and are now indistinguishable from their later surroundings. But some survive, on parcels of land that by luck or intention have not been built upon. The Groton sites are smaller and less dramatic than the Salem, New Hampshire complex or the Vermont sites. They do not announce themselves with the confidence of the larger chambers. They are modest, careful constructions, a series of small chambers and dolmen-like flat-roofed cists and upright stones arranged in configurations that suggest purpose without declaring it. A historian who spent several years in the 1990s documenting the Groton sites before development eliminated, some of them left a detailed record that is preserved in the local historical society. Her documentation includes measured drawings, photographs, and notes on the orientations of the surviving structures. When her orientation data is analysed against astronomical tables for the relevant latitude, several of the surviving structures show alignments to the major solar events, the solstices and the equinoxes, at a level of precision that cannot be attributed to accident. Her documentation also includes one observation that she found puzzling and that she noted without explanation. Two of the structures she documented were oriented not to the sun, but to the moon, specifically to the positions on the horizon where the moon rises and sets at its northernmost and southernmost extremes, events known as the major lunar standstills that occur on an approximately 18.5-year cycle. Lunar standstill orientations are found in several Atlantic megalithic monuments in Europe, most notably at a complex in Scotland called Callanish, and at certain monuments in Ireland. They are not found in any known pre-Columbian North American culture. They require sustained observation of the moon over a period of years because the standstill cycle is nearly 19 years long and you need to observe multiple positions across that cycle to identify the extreme positions with precision. The researcher who documented the Groton sites did not have a theory about what the lunar orientations meant. She simply noted them and moved on. But the lunar standstill orientation is one of the most specific and least ambiguous markers of the Atlantic megalithic astronomical tradition that you can find. It is not something that arises by accident. It requires knowledge of a specific long-period astronomical cycle and the intention to mark it. Finding it in Connecticut, documented in the work of a local historian who had no particular theory about ancient contact to advance, is extraordinary. The documentation exists. It is in the Groton Historical Society. It has not been reviewed by mainstream archaeologists. This is not a unique situation. Across New England, in the historical societies and town archives, and local historical publications of hundreds of towns, there are pieces of this story sitting in folders and boxes and ledgers, documented by people who did not know what they had but who were careful enough to record it. The pieces have not been assembled into the comprehensive picture they could form, because the academic institution that would normally do that work has decided in advance that the picture cannot be what the pieces suggest. The Groton documentation is one piece. There are many others. In western Massachusetts, there is a town called Shutesbury, a small community in the hill country north of Amherst. Shutesbury is the kind of town that appears on maps but not in most travel guides, a place of forest and farms and the occasional art studio deep in the Connecticut River watershed. In the forests of Shutesbury, on a ridge above a brook that runs down to the Quabbin Reservoir, there is a standing stone that has been known to local people for generations. The stone is about 8 feet tall and roughly cylindrical, a column of local granite that stands alone on the ridge in a way that is clearly intentional, that cannot be attributed to the random deposit of glacial activity that left so much of New England's rock scattered across the landscape. Standing stones are common enough in the New England landscape that most of them are dismissed as property markers, geological oddities, or boundary posts from the colonial period. Many of them are exactly that. But some of them are not, and distinguishing between the colonial property markers and the possible pre-colonial standing stones requires exactly the kind of careful investigation that has generally not been applied to the region's stone monuments. The Shutesbury stone has been surveyed. Its position on the ridge, its height and girth, and the orientation of its long axis have all been measured carefully by a researcher who was not looking for anything in particular and who found what she found because she measured everything. The stone's long axis is oriented to the winter solstice sunrise. When you stand at the stone and look in the direction its long axis points, you are looking toward the horizon gap where the sun will rise on the shortest day of the year. This is either a coincidence or a deliberate alignment. There are many ways to try to determine which it is, but the most persuasive is the simplest. Does the stone look like a colonial property marker, or does it look like something that someone placed carefully in a calculated position? A colonial property marker is typically a rough stone set vertically in the ground, with no particular orientation. The Shutesbury stone is 8 feet tall, carefully positioned, and oriented to an astronomical event. It looks less like a property marker and more like a standing stone. In the British and Irish landscape, standing stones of similar height and apparent intention are found throughout the areas of highest Atlantic megalithic monument density. They mark boundaries and routes and astronomical events. They are part of the network of monuments that includes the chambers and the stone circles and the passage tombs. They do not exist in isolation from the other monument types. They are part of a system. If the New England stone chambers represent the passage tomb component of the Atlantic megalithic system, if the standing stones represent another component, the overall picture begins to look less like a series of isolated anomalies and more like a partial reflection of the broader monument landscape of Bronze Age Atlantic Europe. That is a significant claim. I am aware of it. I am not making it as a conclusion. I am presenting it as a hypothesis that the evidence supports at a level that warrants serious investigation. The investigation has not happened, but the hypothesis stands, supported by the evidence available, waiting for the investigation. Let me tell you about a particular moment in the history of this research that I think is important to understand. In 1983, a symposium was held at Harvard University on the subject of pre-Columbian contacts with the Americas. The symposium brought together researchers from archaeology, genetics, linguistics, and related fields to present and discuss the evidence for and against various forms of pre-Columbian contact. The papers presented at that symposium were eventually published in a volume that sat on library shelves for several years, before becoming one of the more cited works in the alternative archaeology literature. The volume was not widely reviewed in mainstream journals, but it received enough attention among researchers interested in the question that it became a kind of touchstone for the field. What is significant about the Harvard Symposium is not the specific papers presented, although some of them are important in their own right. What is significant is that it happened at all. Harvard University, one of the most prestigious academic institutions in the world, hosted a serious symposium on the evidence for pre-Columbian contact. The participants included credentialed researchers with real expertise. The presentations were serious academic work, not fringe speculation. The symposium did not change the mainstream of American archaeology. The resistance was too deeply embedded, the institutional inertia too strong, but it demonstrated that the question was not inherently unserious, that it could be addressed with real scholarship in an appropriate academic setting. The papers from that symposium are still out there, in the libraries and the archives, and the hands of researchers who have read them and thought about them. They are part of the accumulated body of work that the eventual mainstream engagement with this question will have to reckon with. And the eventual mainstream engagement will come, perhaps when a particularly dramatic find forces the issue, when something is excavated or analysed that cannot be explained within the existing framework even by the most determined effort to explain it. Perhaps when the generational change within the field of American archaeology brings in a cohort of researchers who did not build their careers on the Clovis First model and feel less invested in its defence. Perhaps when the political and legal landscape changes in ways that make the investigation of these sites less fraught. Perhaps, and this is the more uncomfortable possibility, when the weight of accumulating evidence simply becomes too heavy for institutional denial to support. That weight is growing. Every year it grows. The genetic databases expand. The archaeoastronomical surveys add more sites. The historical archives yield more incidental documentation. The ground-penetrating radar finds more subsurface features. The botanical studies add more data points. The weight grows, and the mainstream stays silent. But silence is not refutation. Silence is the last resort of an institution that cannot refute but has not yet accepted. History suggests that the last resort eventually fails. Now, there is one more thing I want to tell you about before this story rests for the night. One more piece of evidence that I have been saving, because it is the strangest, and because it is the most difficult to evaluate, and because it has been sitting in the published record for decades, acknowledged and then ignored, in exactly the pattern that characterizes so much of this story. In the 1970s, a researcher conducting a systematic survey of New England historical records found a series of documents that referred to what the colonial writers called a peculiar people, or a tribe apart, or the ancient ones, a group or groups encountered by early settlers in certain inland areas of New England who were described as physically different from the surrounding Native American populations, and as speaking a language that no interpreter could understand. These references are scattered, brief, and impossible to verify. They appear in private correspondence, and in the journals of colonial administrators, and in the records of early missionaries. They are not consistent enough in their details to constitute a clear and coherent account of a specific group. They could reflect genuine encounters with an isolated or unusual population, or they could reflect the projection of European expectations and anxieties onto Native American groups who were unfamiliar, or they could be exaggerations or fabrications. The researcher who found these documents was careful about how he presented them. He described them as intriguing historical anomalies that required further investigation rather than as proof of anything. He published his findings in the NERA journal, where they were noted and discussed without reaching a conclusion. What makes these documents interesting, in the context of everything else we have been discussing, is their consistency with the hypothesis of a small, isolated population with Old World origins surviving in the northeastern interior into the early contact period. If Bronze Age people reached New England several thousand years ago, and if a small community of them, or their descendants, survived and became isolated over the subsequent millennia, they might by the 17th century have been a very small, genetically distinct group, with a language bearing no resemblance to any Native American language, and with physical characteristics that might have appeared unusual to European observers. This is highly speculative. I want to be very clear about that. The colonial documents are ambiguous. The hypothesis they might support is not established by the documents alone. But in the context of the other evidence, the chambers and the genetics and the astronomical alignments and the inscriptions and the botanical data, the colonial documents add one more layer to a picture that has many layers and a consistent direction. The picture suggests that something happened in pre-Columbian North America that the current model does not account for. What that something was, and what its full implications are, we do not yet know. But the question is real, the evidence is real, and the investigation deserves to happen. And with that, I will let this story rest. We have travelled a long way tonight. We have walked through the evidence for and around and behind one of the most contested questions in American archaeology. We have met the researchers who have spent their careers on this question and the institutions that have ignored them. We have stood in the chambers and felt the precision of their construction and the intention embedded in their orientation. We have looked at the marks on their walls and the standing stones in their landscapes and the genetic data in our own cells. We have not arrived at a conclusion because the evidence does not yet support a final conclusion. It supports an investigation. It demands an investigation, and the investigation has not happened. That is the honest state of the question as of tonight. But the question is alive. The evidence is accumulating. The researchers are working, and the stones are patient. They have been patient for 4,000 years. They will be patient for a little longer. And someday, perhaps sooner than we think, someone will stand in the beam of solstice light inside one of those Vermont chambers and know, not guess, not hypothesize, but know who built it and when and why. That knowing will change the story of this continent. Not in the way that bad histories have claimed, not in a way that diminishes or displaces the indigenous peoples whose home this continent has been for thousands of years, but in the way that genuine understanding always changes things, by making the picture larger, more complex, more connected to the wider human story. The Americas are part of the human world. They always have been. The isolation was never complete, and the contact was probably never as rare as the official story requires. The stones of New England are part of the evidence for that. And the story they are telling, in the patient language of stone and alignment, and the angle of the winter sun, is one of the most interesting stories in the human record. I will leave you with that. The night is long, the forest is quiet, the chambers are on their hillsides, aligned to the stars. Dream well, the story will be waiting for you in the morning, along with the stones, along with the question, along with the patient accumulation of evidence that is building, slowly, toward the truth. Good night. Since you are still with me in the dark, still listening, let me take you a little further. Let me go into some of the territory I touched briefly earlier and stay there longer, because the territory deserves more than a passing mention. I want to talk to you about the Great Lakes copper. The Great Lakes region of North America contains one of the largest deposits of native copper, pure metallic copper, that exists as natural nuggets and sheets in the rock, in the world. The copper mines of Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula in what is now Michigan were mined intensively, by some estimates, over a period of several thousand years beginning roughly 6,000 years ago. The mining was prehistoric, conducted by people who left behind pits and excavation tools and the remnants of their work in quantities that stagger the imagination. Archaeologists who have studied the mining record estimate that somewhere between 1.5 billion pounds of copper were removed from the Lake Superior region over the period of ancient mining. That is an extraordinary quantity. It is far more than the amount of copper found in the archaeological record of North American cultures from the relevant periods. The question of where all that copper went has been hanging over Great Lakes archaeology for the better part of a century. The conventional answer is that the copper was used locally, that it was worked into tools and ornaments and traded within North America, and that the disparity between the amount mined and the amount found is the result of recycling, reuse, and the limitations of what has been recovered archaeologically. This answer is plausible. But several researchers have pointed out that it requires copper recycling rates and trade distributions that have no parallel in any other ancient culture's use of copper, and that the sheer scale of the mining, beginning at a time when North American cultures were supposedly small, mobile hunter-gatherer bands, is difficult to reconcile with the idea of entirely local demand. A Bronze Age European researcher named Gunnar Thompson spent years investigating the possibility that ancient Mediterranean and Northern European cultures obtained Bronze Age copper from the Great Lakes, and that the trade routes that connected the copper source to the bronze-producing cultures of Europe are the mechanism by which pre-Columbian Atlantic contact occurred. His hypothesis is that Bronze Age ships crossed the Atlantic not in search of new lands, but in search of copper, one of the two essential ingredients in bronze along with tin, and that the mining of the Great Lakes region was driven by demand from the bronze-producing cultures of the Old World. This hypothesis is bold, and it has been criticized on multiple grounds. The logistics of shipping copper across the Atlantic in the Bronze Age are challenging, though not impossible given what we know about Bronze Age maritime capacity. The identification of North American copper in Old World Bronze Age objects has been claimed by Thompson and disputed by other researchers. The connection between the timing of the Great Lakes mining peak and the Bronze Age copper needs in the Mediterranean is suggestive but not conclusive. But the hypothesis has not been formally refuted. It has been dismissed, which is different. Dismissal does not require engaging with the evidence. It requires only a confident assertion that the premise is impossible. The premise that Bronze Age ships could cross the North Atlantic has been demonstrated by experiment. It is not impossible. It may not have happened, but it could have happened. And the missing copper, the billion-plus pounds of metal that was mined from the Great Lakes and has not been found in the North American archaeological record, is a genuine mystery. The copper went somewhere. If it did not stay in North America, where did it go? Thompson's answer is that it went to Europe. The mainstream answer is that it stayed in North America and we simply have not found it. Neither answer has been proven. Then, neither has been refuted. The mystery remains, large and heavy as copper, sitting in the record. I find the Great Lakes copper mystery one of the most compelling aspects of this whole discussion, because it is so concrete. 1 billion pounds is a lot of copper. That is not a small anomaly. That is a large, documented, quantified discrepancy between what was mined and what has been found in the archaeological record. Either the copper is in North America somewhere, awaiting discovery in archaeological contexts that have not yet been found or recognized, or it is somewhere else. Where else could it be? The obvious answer is Europe, where Bronze Age peoples were desperately in need of copper, and where the archaeological record of the Bronze Age shows large quantities of copper whose ultimate origin has not been definitively identified. Bronze Age European copper has been analyzed using isotopic methods that can, in principle, identify the geological source of the copper by its isotopic signature. The results of these analyses have been mixed and disputed. Some analyses have suggested that significant quantities of European Bronze Age copper came from sources that do not match any known European deposit. Others have argued that the matching to New World deposits is not conclusive. This is exactly the kind of scientific question that should be the subject of major funded research programs, bringing together the best available isotopic analysis techniques and the largest possible comparative database of copper sources from both the New World and the Old. That research has not been done at the scale required to provide definitive answers. Why not? Because doing it at the required scale would require taking seriously the possibility that the answers might point toward New World sources, which would require taking seriously the possibility of transatlantic contact in the Bronze Age, which requires revising the existing model. The model protects itself. But the copper is real, the discrepancy is real, the question is real, and it will not go away. Let me now tell you about a very specific kind of artifact that has been found at a small number of sites in North America, and that is, if genuine, one of the most extraordinary pieces of evidence in this entire discussion. These artifacts are carved stone tablets, small enough to hold in the hand, bearing inscriptions in ancient scripts that have their closest analogues in the Old World. I mentioned the Bat Creek stone earlier, and the Grave Creek stone. There are several others. One of the most interesting is an object known as the Los Lunas Decalogue stone, a large boulder in New Mexico bearing an inscription in Paleo-Hebrew that appears to be a version of the Ten Commandments. The stone is in a location that was not easily accessible to a forger in the 19th century, when it was first documented by a European American. It has been analyzed by linguists who specialize in ancient Hebrew, and the consensus among those specialists is that the inscription is genuine Paleo-Hebrew, and that it includes certain archaic linguistic features that a modern forger would need to be extraordinarily knowledgeable to reproduce. The stone has been dated indirectly by the degree of weathering of the inscription compared to the natural weathering of the surrounding boulder surface. The inscription appears old, with weathering consistent with an age of at least several centuries, possibly much more. The mainstream archaeological response is that the stone is a forgery or a misidentification, though the specific mechanism of forgery has never been satisfactorily explained. The stone's location in a remote area of New Mexico raises questions about how a forger would have placed it there and why. I am not in a position to tell you that the Los Lunas Decalogue stone is genuine. I am in a position to tell you that the arguments for its being genuine are more substantial than the mainstream dismissal suggests, and that it deserves the kind of systematic, published, peer-reviewed analysis that it has not received. There is a pattern here, as there is throughout this story. Objects that the model says cannot be genuine receive a level of scrutiny insufficient to resolve the question in either direction, and are then dismissed based on the insufficiency of the evidence, rather than on positive evidence of forgery. The insufficient evidence is often the result of insufficient investigation, which is often the result of the prior decision that the object cannot be genuine. The circular logic is frustrating, but it is also, in a strange way, revealing. The maintenance of the circle requires effort. It requires people to decide, before looking, what they will see. That kind of effort is not what you invest in a question that you are genuinely confident you can answer. You invest that effort in a question that you are afraid to leave open. The possibility that ancient Semitic people left inscriptions in the American Southwest is frightening to the institution of American archaeology in ways that deserve examination. What exactly is the fear? What would it mean for the field, for the legal frameworks, for the broader cultural and political landscape? Some of those fears are legitimate. The history of claims about ancient Semitic contact with the Americas is entangled with Mormon theology, with various forms of anti-indigenous racism, with the kind of pseudo-history that has been used to deny Native American peoples their heritage. Those entanglements are real, and the fear of contributing to them, even inadvertently, is understandable. But the solution to those entanglements is not to suppress the evidence. It is to engage with the evidence rigorously and honestly, to distinguish between what the evidence actually shows and what ideologues want it to show, and to refuse to let the misuse of a question determine whether the question can be asked. The Los Lunas Decalogue stone, the Bat Creek stone, the Grave Creek stone, and the other inscribed objects in this story do not belong to any ideology. They are physical objects in the world. They either are what they appear to be, or they are not. Determining which requires investigation, not prior decision. That investigation is owed to the question. It is owed to the researchers who have raised it. And in a strange way, it is owed to the objects themselves, which have been sitting in museums and on hillsides and in archives for over a century, waiting for someone to look at them honestly. Let me tell you now about the thing that first made me take this whole subject seriously. It is not a stone or an inscription or a genetic anomaly. It is a map. In 1513, a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis compiled a map of the world using sources that he described as including very old charts, some of them ancient. The map, drawn on gazelle hide, survived and was rediscovered in 1929 in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. When modern cartographers examined it, they found something astonishing. The map showed the coastlines of the Americas with a precision that should not have been possible in 1513, before European exploration had mapped more than the Caribbean and the northeastern coast of South America. More remarkably, the map appeared to show the coastline of Antarctica, a continent that was not officially discovered until 1820, and whose coastline beneath the ice was not fully mapped until the 1950s using seismic surveys. The Piri Reis map controversy has generated enormous argument over the past century. Some researchers have argued that the apparent showing of Antarctica is a coincidence, that the southern coastline on the map is actually a distorted representation of Patagonia or some other known region. Others have argued that the precision of the map proves it was copied from sources far more ancient than any known chart, possibly from the records of a civilization that mapped the world in a remote prehistoric period. I am not going to resolve the Piri Reis map controversy here. The arguments are complex and technical, and I do not think they can be resolved in a narrative format. What I want to point to is what the map represents in the context of our broader discussion. Evidence that ancient geographical knowledge may have been more extensive than the official historical record suggests, and that the mechanisms by which that knowledge was transmitted across time are poorly understood. Piri Reis himself described using very old charts. Where did those charts come from? Who made them? When? The questions attached to the map are in some ways as interesting as the map itself. What the Piri Reis map, whether or not its most dramatic interpretations are correct, illustrates is that the official history of geographical knowledge is incomplete. Maps that should not have existed apparently did exist. Knowledge that should not have been available apparently was available. The story of what people knew and when they knew it is more complicated than the official narrative allows. And if the official narrative of geographical knowledge is more complicated than it appears, then the official narrative of human movement and contact is also likely more complicated than it appears. The stones of New England and the Piri Reis map, and the missing Great Lakes copper, and the Bat Creek stone, and haplogroup X2A, and the astronomical alignments, and the inscriptions, and the oral traditions of the northeastern tribes all point in the same direction, not to a single unified theory of pre-Columbian contact, but to a recognition that the human story of the Americas is more complex and more connected to the wider human world than the current model of American prehistory allows. That is the honest summary of what the evidence suggests. It does not mean that everything in the alternative archaeology literature is correct. Much of it is not. The field attracts speculation and wishful thinking and outright fraud alongside the genuine scholarship, and distinguishing between them requires exactly the kind of careful, critical, methodologically rigorous engagement that the mainstream has been unwilling to provide. But the genuine scholarship is there. The researchers doing careful work are there. The evidence they have assembled is there. And the questions they are asking deserve answers that the mainstream has not provided. That is where we are. And that is, when you step back and look at it, an extraordinary place to be. We are at the edge of one of the most significant potential revisions in the history of American archaeology. The revision may come soon or it may take another generation, but the evidence is pointing in a direction, and the direction is clear, and eventually the institution will have to follow. The stones of New England will be part of what forces the issue. They are too well built, too precisely aligned, too consistently constructed to be dismissed indefinitely. The ground-penetrating radar surveys will eventually lead to excavations, and the excavations will eventually yield the kind of datable materials that will force a reckoning. The ancient DNA research will eventually produce genetic data from northeastern North America that is comprehensive enough to test the haplogroup X2, a hypothesis, properly. Eventually, the convergence of evidence will be too great for silence to sustain, and the story that emerges from that convergence will be one of the great stories in the history of human archaeology. The story of a crossing that changed the world, that left monuments in stone on the hillsides of New England, that may have influenced the cultures of the Northeast in ways we have not yet recognized, that wove Old World knowledge and Old World tradition into the fabric of the American past in ways that centuries of scholarship have not been willing to see. That story is waiting to be told. The stones are waiting to tell it. The light is ready. All we have to do is show up and look. You have been with me for a long time tonight, through forests and hillsides and archives and controversies and the specific gravity of old stones on winter mornings. If you are still here, if sleep has not yet taken you, I want to say something that I mean sincerely. The willingness to sit with questions that do not have answers, to follow evidence into territories where the maps run out, to hold uncertainty without resolving it into either comfortable belief or comfortable dismissal, that is one of the most human and most admirable things there is. It is what science requires, it is what honest inquiry requires, and it is what these stones, in their patient, aligned, intentional presence in the New England landscape, are asking of us. They are asking us to look without deciding in advance what we will see. They are asking us to measure before we conclude. They are asking us to be as careful in our understanding as they were in their construction. That is a reasonable request. The night is ending, somewhere. The sky is beginning to consider the idea of morning. And in Vermont, on a hillside, in a chamber that has been waiting patiently through more winters than any of us will live, the angle of the dawn light is approaching the precise angle it will need to enter that passage. Not today, not this morning. The solstice is weeks away or months away or just past, depending on when you are listening to this. But it will come. It always comes. The wheel turns and the sun moves and the light enters the chamber and the back wall holds it for its 20 minutes of gold. That is the promise the builders made when they aligned the entrance. A promise not to any specific person or any specific generation, but to time itself, to the future, to whoever would be standing there when the moment came. The promise has been kept. For thousands of years, the promise has been kept. That is the most remarkable thing about these stones. Not the mystery of who built them, as fascinating as that mystery is. Not the evidence for pre-Columbian contact, as significant as that evidence may be. But the simple fact that the alignment works. They built it right. They built it to last. And it lasted. And on the solstice morning, for the thousands of solstice mornings that have passed since the chamber was built, the light has entered, faithful as geometry, faithful as the movement of the earth around the sun, Faithful as the intention that placed those stones in that orientation on that hillside. Faithful. That word feels right for those stones. They are faithful to their purpose across an ocean of time. We should be faithful to ours. To understand, to investigate, to tell the truth about what we find. Good night. Sleep well. Dream of old stones and faithful light, and the long, patient, extraordinary story of what it means to be human on this planet, moving across it, marking it, leaving behind in the landscape evidence that we were here and that we knew something and that we built it to last. It lasted. It is still there. Go and find it. But first, sleep. There is something else I want to leave you with. Something that is less about the evidence and more about what the evidence means for the way we understand ourselves. Every mystery like this one, every question about the deep past that refuses to be tidied away into the existing categories, is ultimately a question about the range of human possibility. What were people capable of? How far did they go? What did they build and why? How much did they understand about the sky and the sea and the stone? The story of pre-Columbian North America, as the official model tells it, is already a story of extraordinary human achievement. The cultures that built Cahokia and the Newark earthworks and the Pueblo Bonito complex of Chaco Canyon were doing remarkable things with limited technology and in challenging environments. The agricultural traditions of the American Southwest, the trade networks of the Hopewell culture, the astronomical knowledge embedded in the great earthworks of Ohio, all of these represent achievements that should fill us with genuine admiration. But the official model also imposes a kind of ceiling on our admiration. It says, these were isolated achievements. These people were not connected to the wider world. They developed what they developed in separation. And that separation, while not making their achievements less real, makes the story smaller than it might otherwise be. The alternative, the story the New England Chamber evidence points toward, is not a smaller story. It is a larger one. It says, these people, or at least some of the people who inhabited this continent before European colonization, were connected to a wider world. They were part of a human network that spanned the Atlantic. They received and transmitted knowledge, material objects, and possibly people across an ocean that the official story says was uncrossable. That is a bigger story, a more connected story, a more fully human story, because human beings are by nature connected and mobile and curious and willing to cross the water to see what is on the other side. The Americas were always part of the human world. The official story has tried to make them an exception, a separate development, a pristine isolation that was only broken when Columbus arrived. That story, whatever its other merits, diminishes the Americas. It makes them less than part of the human story rather than central to it. The stones of New England, if they mean what the evidence suggests they mean, are not evidence of European superiority or of indigenous inferiority. They are evidence of human connectivity. They are evidence that the Atlantic was not the barrier the official story needs it to be, that people were crossing it in both directions, or at least in one direction, long before the age of exploration. That evidence, if it is confirmed, will not diminish the indigenous peoples of North America. It will confirm what the indigenous peoples of North America have often said about themselves, that they are part of a larger human world, that their history is connected to the wider history of humanity, that the story of this continent did not begin in isolation and does not need to be told that way. The stones say, we are all connected. The ocean is not a wall. The horizon is not a limit. People went there and built something, and the something is still there. That is worth knowing. That is worth investigating. That is worth, on a winter night when the questions are larger than the answers, and the darkness outside is deep, and the wind in the trees sounds like it might be carrying something from a long way away, worth lying quietly and thinking about. The human world is bigger than any of our models for it. The stones know this. They have always known it. And now, finally, after this long journey through the evidence and the mysteries and the silences and the possibilities, I will let you sleep. The questions will be there in the morning. The stones will be there on their hillsides. The evidence will continue to accumulate, slowly and in the face of institutional resistance, toward the truth. And somewhere in Vermont, in a forest that has grown up around stones that were ancient before the forest was young, a chamber sits on a hillside, its entrance facing the northeast, its corbelled ceiling holding up the weight of the earth above it, its interior cool and dark and smelling of old stone and time. The solstice will come. the light will enter, the back wall will hold it for its brief and faithful time. The builders knew that would happen when they built it. They built it for exactly that moment. And the moment keeps coming back, year after year after year, faithful to the geometry that anonymous hands embedded in stone on a Vermont hillside an unknowable number of winters ago. That faithfulness is one of the most beautiful things I know about. Sleep now. Let the questions rest. Let the stones hold what they hold. And tomorrow, if you feel moved to, go outside and look at the landscape around you, and remember that the human story is longer and stranger and more connected than any of our official accounts of it can fully contain. That the people who came before us, all of them, everywhere, were capable of extraordinary things. That they crossed oceans we said they could not cross and built monuments we cannot fully explain and left behind them in the landscape, a record of their presence that is still speaking. In the patient language of stone and alignment and the angle of the winter sun, it is speaking to you. Good night. There is one more thing I want to sit with before this night closes entirely. Throughout everything we have discussed, from the stone chambers and their astronomical alignments to the genetic anomalies and the inscriptions and the colonial records, and the missing copper and the underwater archaeology, and the botanical evidence and the linguistic comparisons, there is a thread that runs through all of it that I have not quite named directly. The thread is this. The people who built those chambers understood something about the relationship between the built environment and the natural world that we have largely lost. They understood that a building can be in conversation with its landscape, that a structure can be oriented not just for practical shelter but for meaning, for ceremony, for the marking of moments that matter. That understanding is not uniquely theirs. It is found in cultures all over the world, in the great temple complexes of Southeast Asia that align to the solstice and the equinox, in the pre-Columbian monuments of Mexico and Central America that track the movements of Venus, in the earth lodges of the plains, peoples that orient their entrances to the sunrise, in the kivas of the Pueblo peoples that align their sipapu, the symbolic hole to the underworld, with cosmic directions. The impulse to make a building that is in conversation with the sky is a deeply human impulse. It arises wherever people have the time and the knowledge and the care to act on it. What the New England Chambers suggest is that people with the time and the knowledge and the care were in New England earlier than the official story allows, and that they acted on that impulse in the specific technical form of the Atlantic megalithic tradition, corbelled stone chambers aligned to the seasonal turning points. That specific technical form is traceable. It has a history. It has a homeland in the Atlantic coast of Europe, and its presence in New England is a question that demands an answer. The answer is not yet available, but the question is alive, and alive questions are the engine of understanding. Without them, we stop learning. With them, we are always on the edge of knowing more than we knew yesterday. These stones have been a question in the landscape of New England for longer than anyone alive can remember. They will continue to be a question until someone gives them the honest and rigorous investigation they deserve. When that investigation comes, and it will come, the people doing it will stand in that corridor of solstice light, in the cold interior of an old stone chamber on a Vermont hill, and they will feel what every person who has stood there has felt, that they are in the presence of intention, that someone knew something here, that someone cared, and that caring, crystallized in stone and alignment and the patient waiting of millennia, will be the most human thing they have ever encountered. The night is deep, the forest is quiet, the stones are on their hillsides, aligned to the sky, faithful to their purpose. Rest now. The story will be here when you wake. Good night. And if you found something tonight in these questions, something worth holding, something that made the dark a little more interesting and the unknown a little less frightening, then these stones have done what stones like them have always done. They have marked the moment. They have held the light. They have said, someone was here, someone knew, someone built this to last. It lasted. You are listening to it still. That is everything. There are places on this earth that hold time differently than others. Not metaphorically, not in the sense of atmosphere or mood, but in a literal, physical, measurable way. The stone chambers of New England are such places. They hold time in the precision of their construction, in the accuracy of their alignments, in the organic material sealed beneath their foundation stones, that carbon dating has placed thousands of years in the past. They hold time the way all monuments hold time, as deliberate acts of preservation, of saying, this moment matters, and we are going to make certain that the evidence of its mattering survives. The people who built them understood something that we are only beginning to recover, that time is not an arrow moving in one direction only. It is a circle, a spiral, a wheel that turns. The solstice comes back every year, the equinox returns, the seasons repeat. The sky turns above the same hills that it has always turned above, and in that turning, that faithful repetition of the astronomical calendar that the chambers mark, there is something that the builders wanted to hold on to, that they encoded in stone so that it would outlast the language they spoke and the names they carried, and the specific details of the lives they lived. What they encoded is a relationship between the built and the cosmic, between the human-made and the naturally given, between the brief life of any one person and the immense time span of the turning heavens. That relationship is still readable, in the chambers, in the alignments, in the light that enters on the right morning. We are still part of it. We always were. The night holds you now. The questions have settled into the background, where they belong at this hour, becoming the texture of sleep rather than the obstacle to it. The stones are on their hillsides. The light is faithful. The wheel turns. Sleep well and dream of what remains. What makes these stones so particular, so specific in their power, is that they do not ask you to believe anything. They do not require faith. They only require presence and attention and the willingness to measure what is actually there. The measurements speak for themselves. The alignments are what they are. The construction is what it is. The age markers in the soil beneath the foundation stones are what they are. Presence, attention, measurement. These are the only tools the stones ask you to bring. And in the practice of bringing them, something happens that is hard to name, but that everyone who has spent serious time at these sites has described in some form. You become aware that you are in conversation with a past that is not dead, not finished, not fully understood, but real. As real as the granite under your hands, as real as the angle of the light. That is where we are. That is where the story is. And the story is still being written in the journals and the field notes and the genetic databases and the ground-penetrating radar surveys and the careful work of researchers who have not yet given up on the question. The story is still being written, and you have been part of it tonight, listening in the dark, following the thread into the old forests and the cold chambers and the long unresolved question of who built what and why and when. Thank you for that. Good night. The morning will come. It always comes. And on some future morning, the morning that the investigation finally happens, that the excavation finally takes place, that the datable materials are finally recovered and analysed and published, and engaged with by the institution that has been silent for so long, the story that the chambers have been telling in stone and light will finally be told in words that the wider world can hear. That morning is coming. The stones are waiting for it. So are we. The cold morning comes to the Vermont forest the same way it always has. Without announcement, without ceremony, the darkness simply beginning to loosen at its edges, grey filtering through the bare trees, the snow on the ground reflecting back what little light there is. The chamber on the hillside is the same temperature it was before dawn, cold and still and dark inside, the stones holding their positions against the weight of the earth and the slow press of winters past counting. And then the light shifts at the entrance. The grey brightens to something warmer. And there it is, as promised, as built, as intended, by hands that no living memory recalls. The rectangle of gold travelling down the passage and arriving, faithful as it has always been, at the back wall of the chamber. It holds for its allotted time. Then it moves on. And the chamber is grey and quiet again, waiting, as it has always waited, for the next time.